What if the crown came with a countdown? Kings and queens, all dead before 20. Some were murdered, some vanished, some were crowned before they could walk, and buried before they could rule. This isn't a list of noble deaths. It's a slow-motion collapse of empires, seen through the eyes of children dressed as gods. Because in history, the throne is never empty for long, but sometimes the one who wears it doesn't live long enough to warm the seat. Welcome to 33 kings and queens who died too soon. And yes, it gets darker from here. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. City, country, and maybe, what time is it over there? Midnight in Manila? Dawn in Dublin? 3 a.m. in Texas? Because if you're like us, you're probably up way too late, listening to stories of rulers who never lived long enough to have a bedtime. 1. Ptolemy XIII. If you had to choose the worst time in history to be a teenage king, the year 48 BCE would be a strong contender. It was an era when alliances were stitched with gold leaf and slit throats, and where adolescence was no excuse for incompetence. If anything, it was a liability. Just ask Ptolemy XIII, the boy who became Pharaoh of Egypt, brother to Cleopatra, and collateral damage in a war of gods pretending to be men. He was about 14 when the river swallowed him. Ptolemy XIII, Theos Philopator, was born into one of the most dysfunctional dynasties ever to misuse eyeliner. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by that point, mostly through inbreeding, backstabbing, and the occasional sponsorship of astronomy. They were Macedonian Greeks ruling over Egyptians while pretending to be pharaohs, and nobody really liked them, but they were rich, and that tends to soften criticism. Ptolemy XIII's reign was technically a joint one with his sister wife Cleopatra VII, because nothing says stable succession like mandatory incest. They were crowned together in name, but in practice, Egypt's elite council, the royal regents, backed the boy, not the girl. Cleopatra, for all her charisma, was 18 and inconveniently opinionated. Ptolemy, on the other hand, was a blank page with a crown, ready for others to write their ambitions upon. For a moment, Egypt teetered on the edge of a modern state. Cleopatra spoke Egyptian, issued coins with her face on them, and even dropped the performative Greek goddess shtick. But power, like gravity, follows mass, and the mass of old men advising a teenage king was heavy. Within a year, Cleopatra was exiled. This might have been a temporary setback had Julius Caesar not entered the chat. The Roman Civil War had spilled into Alexandria like wine across a silk map, staining everything with imperial drama. Caesar was chasing his rival Pompey, who had just been murdered by Ptolemy's men in what they thought was a strategic favor. Caesar, predictably, was disgusted. Nothing annoyed him more than amateurs trying to impress him with blood. He decided to stay. Ptolemy, still a child, now had the most dangerous man in the world living in his palace. Worse, Caesar promptly invited Cleopatra back and declared her co-ruler again. The boy's advisors panicked. Civil war broke out in the palace again. Only this time, there were Roman siege weapons pointed at the doors. And here's where Ptolemy XIII loses the plot entirely. Not because he was evil or incompetent, but because the narrative was never his. He was 14, possibly 15, and already a puppet dangling over a bonfire. As Caesar's forces pushed through Alexandria, the young king tried to flee across the Nile. No one's sure if he slipped, if the boat capsized, or if it was simply the weight of a collapsing regime that pulled him under. What's agreed on is that Ptolemy XIII drowned, in full royal armor no less. A child, costumed as a god, sinking like a stone while 2 empires shook hands over his grave. The official spin was that the war was over, order restored, and Cleopatra enthroned beside another younger brother. But the water didn't care. The Nile has a habit of swallowing inconvenient kings and never giving back their bodies or their secrets. Ptolemy the XIII left behind no great quote, no philosophy, no legacy, just an empty tomb and a cautionary tale. That in monarchies, especially ones draped in gold and incest, youth is not an advantage, it's a death sentence with a better view. And yet, he was not the last child sacrificed at the altar of ambition, not even the last in his own family, because just a few years later, another boy would walk into a throne room with Cleopatra at his side, and this one bore the blood of both Caesar and Egypt. His name was Ptolemy XV, better known as Caesarion, and like his half-brother before him, he too was a king destined to die before anyone let him grow up. 2. Ptolemy XV, Hazarion. It's easy to forget that Ptolemy XV, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, was a teenager when he died. History usually paints him as a footnote, a minor appendage to Cleopatra's myth, a claim to legitimacy that Rome would never tolerate. But beneath the papyrus of propaganda, there's the image of a boy who spent his short life being told he was a god, only to discover that even gods can be hunted down. He was called Caesarion, Little Caesar, a name that was both a blessing and a death sentence. Born in 47 BCE, he entered the world as a living question mark, the supposed child of Julius Caesar, recognized by Cleopatra but never formally acknowledged by Rome. His very existence was a political act, a spark tossed into the dry tinder of civil war. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, used him as a symbol, Egypt reborn, independent from Rome, a bridge between two civilizations. To the Alexandrians, he was Horus incarnate, the divine child who would restore Ma'at, the cosmic order. To Rome, he was an inconvenient rumor with a pulse. Imagine growing up under that shadow. Caesarion's earliest memories were probably of temples and incense, of priests bowing before him, of gold amulets pressed into his small hands. Everything about his childhood was staged to project inevitability. He wasn't just Cleopatra's son, he was Egypt's insurance policy. His tutors would have taught him Greek philosophy, Egyptian ritual, and the delicate art of ruling a land divided between old traditions and new conquerors. He was trained to be both pharaoh and cosmopolitan prince, but no one could train him to be a teenager in a world where every adult was playing chess with his life. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra saw the writing on the wall but doubled down. She returned to Egypt and began to style Caesarion as Caesar's rightful heir, placing his name alongside her own on decrees, commissioning statues of him as a miniature pharaoh. He was 6 years old, dressed in royal robes, already a co-ruler of Egypt. It was less a childhood than a coronation extended over a decade. Then came Mark Antony, and with him the grand experiment of an Eastern empire. Cleopatra and Antony used Caesarion to legitimize their power, presenting him to the world as King of Kings. At 12, the boy was paraded before the Alexandrian crowd in the so-called Donations of Alexandria, a massive ceremony where Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra's children. Caesarion, at the center, was declared not just pharaoh, but ruler of Rome's eastern lands. It was theater, of course, but theater with armies behind it. Rome, however, was not amused. Octavian, the future Augustus, saw in Caesarion not a child, but a rival. His propaganda machine began to churn, painting Antony and Cleopatra as decadent traitors, and Caesarion as an illegitimate pretender. 2. Caesar's is one too many, he is alleged to have said, though the line may be apocryphal. Whether he said it or not, the sentiment defined his strategy. Rome could not afford a living heir of Julius Caesar outside its control. The boy had to go. In 30 BCE, after Antony and Cleopatra's defeat at Actium, Egypt crumbled. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra sealed her own fate. Caesarion, now 16 or 17, was suddenly alone. Cleopatra reportedly sent him eastward, perhaps to India or Nubia, perhaps to escape, perhaps as a decoy. Ancient sources disagree. Some say he was captured on the road. Others claim Octavian lured him back with promises of clemency. What is certain is that he never made it to adulthood. Somewhere between the palace and the horizon, Caesarion disappeared into history. Octavian returned to Rome with Egypt as his prize and a carefully crafted story. Cleopatra's son had been dealt with. No details, no spectacle, just a quiet erasure. The last pharaoh of Egypt, the only son of Julius Caesar, gone before the world could decide who he really was. And yet the mystery lingers. Did Caesarion actually die at 16, or did he slip away into exile? Later, legends whispered of a boy king living anonymously in India, a phantom heir who outlived Augustus. The historian Josephus hints at secret negotiations. Even Roman sources, usually eager to gloat, are oddly silent about his end. It's as if the Nile had claimed another young king, not with water this time, but with silence. What's tragic about Caesarion isn't just his death, it's his invisibility. His entire life was curated, his identity scripted, his destiny borrowed from other people's ambitions. He never got to be a child, a prince on his own terms, or even a villain. History reduced him to a pawn, and then, with Octavian's blessing, swept him off the board. Yet his shadow stretches far. He represents the moment Egypt stopped being Egypt, when the last pharaoh's crown passed from a living boy to a distant emperor in Rome. After Caesarion, there would be no more child gods on the Nile, no more dynasties of sibling rulers playing at immortality. Egypt became a province, and Caesarion became a ghost. And still, there's an echo, a question that nags like a papyrus fragment with missing lines. If a boy raised to be a god cannot outgrow the ambitions of his parents, what chance does any heir have? How many other young monarchs were born into crowns only to be smothered by them before they fit? We don't have to wait long for the answer, because on the far edges of the Mediterranean, in a rising empire of its own, another boy inherited a throne he could not keep. His name was Osman II, a reformer, a dreamer, a sultan at 17 who thought he could change the system. Like Caesarion, he discovered that crowns are sometimes just gilded targets. If you're still here 2 stories in, you're one of us now. The kind who stays up past midnight wondering how a teenage pharaoh ended up as a political cautionary tale. So before we go any further, hit subscribe if you haven't already. It keeps the stories coming, and let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Is the sun coming up, or have you not slept yet? Either way, you're in good company. 3. Osman X. The palace at Topkapi, with its courtyards of marble and its chambers filled with whispers, has seen thousands of intrigues, but few as haunting as the brief life of Osman II. Born in 1604, heir to an empire spanning 3 continents, Osman seemed at first to be the archetype of the Ottoman golden child, brilliant, ambitious, and restless. Yet in his short reign, just 4 years from 1618 to 1622, he managed to step on every pressure point in the Ottoman system at once. He wanted to reform it. It wanted to reform him. The tension would kill him before his 18th birthday. Osman II inherited a crown that was already wobbling. The Ottoman Empire, once a juggernaut, was showing hairline cracks. Janissaries, the elite military corps originally designed as a disciplined guard force, had become a hereditary caste, more interested in privileges than battle. Court factions bickered like rival playwrights, trying to rewrite the same tragic ending. The treasury was strained. The aura of invincibility, carefully built over centuries, was fading. Into this steps a teenager. He was not an ordinary teenager, though. Osman II was tall, handsome, multilingual, and, according to chroniclers, unusually self-possessed. He wrote poetry, studied theology, and cultivated a piety that was genuine rather than performative. In an era when sultans often left the details of governance to viziers, Osman showed up. He sat in council meetings. He read reports. He dreamed dangerously of a rejuvenated empire. At first, his energy was welcomed. The empire needed a shake-up. But Osman's ideas went beyond minor tweaks. He envisioned a Janissary corps stripped of its privileges, restored to its old discipline, and replenished with recruits from Anatolia. He wanted to cut off the comfortable lifeline of patronage and force his army to become soldiers again. In other words, he proposed to dismantle the power base of the very people who guarded his throne. This was not just bold, it was naive. Because for all his intelligence, Osman II underestimated the psychology of a system built on inertia. The Janissaries were no longer just a military corps. They were a political class, a street force, and a kingmaker. They had deposed sultans before. They could do it again. Osman's age, just 17, did not shield him from their resentment. If anything, it amplified it. He was a boy telling veterans how to fight. Still, he pressed on. In 1621, he personally led a campaign against Poland at the Battle of Khotyn. Though the battle ended inconclusively, Osman saw it as proof of his soldiers' unreliability. Returning to Istanbul, he accelerated his reforms, planning even to travel to Mecca, a pilgrimage that would have allowed him to recruit a new loyal army outside the Janissaries' reach. It was a shrewd move, but also a signal flare. The old guard read it as an announcement of war. In the spring of 1622, the tension snapped. The Kiki Janissaries mutinied, storming the palace. What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a slow-motion implosion of imperial decorum. Ministers were dragged out and humiliated. Demands were issued, then rescinded, then reissued. In the middle of it all stood Osman II, the young sultan who had dared to imagine himself a reformer. He reportedly tried to reason with them, to appeal to their loyalty, to salvage dignity from chaos. But institutions like storms do not negotiate. At 17, Osman II was dethroned, the first Ottoman sultan to be deposed by his own guards in such a direct and public fashion. It was an event that broke a taboo and set a precedent. The Janissaries had tasted the power of removing a reigning sultan, and they would not forget it. The empire would pay the price for centuries. The details of Osman's final hours are obscured by conflicting accounts, each filtered through the biases of chroniclers writing under new regimes. What is clear is that he did not return from his pilgrimage. One moment he was the most powerful teenager in the Islamic world, the next he was gone, leaving behind a throne, a stunned city, and an empire still grappling with the consequences of his unfinished revolution. Yet Osman II's story is more than just a cautionary tale about youth and power. It is a window into the paradox of monarchy itself, the very qualities that make a ruler admirable. Vision, courage, impatience with corruption can also make him intolerable to the system that sustains him. A middle-aged sultan might have compromised. A boy still believed he could change the rules, and in this sense, Osman II stands in a grim fraternity with other young monarchs whose crowns outlasted their lives. They all began with dreams larger than their circumstances and ended as lessons in the limits of authority. But if the Ottoman palace was a maze of intrigue, the next story takes us to a different kind of labyrinth, a Cairo court, where sultans were not just young, but sometimes literal children, lifted and discarded like pawns on a marble chessboard. One such boy was Al-Ashraf Kujuk, a puppet sultan barely 11 years old when he wore Egypt's most dangerous crown. If Osman's tragedy was trying to rule too much, Kujuk's was never being allowed to rule at all. 4. Al-Ashraf Kujuk. There are kings who rise to power through bloodline, others through conquest, and then there are those like Al-Ashraf Kujuk, crowned in a whisper, ruled through others, and remembered not for what they did, but for what was done to them. A Mamluk sultan of Egypt for just over a year in the mid-14th century, Kujuk never led armies, never passed laws, never ruled in any meaningful sense. He was 11 when he was placed on the throne and barely 12 when he died. But in that short window, the court that surrounded him became a study in human ambition masquerading as divine order. To understand Kujuk, one must understand the world he was born into, the Mamluk Sultanate, a regime where former slaves became sultans, and sultans were sometimes more disposable than their ceremonial robes. The Mamluk system was famously meritocratic at its core, at least in theory. It took enslaved boys from the Caucasus, Anatolia, and Central Asia, trained them as elite cavalrymen, and launched them into a military aristocracy. But behind this illusion of order was a brutal truth. Power belonged not to titles, but to those with swords, alliances, and the patience to wait. Kujuk, the son of a previous sultan, was not one of these men. He was a child, fragile, impressionable, ceremonial. When he was crowned in 1341, it wasn't because anyone thought he would lead the Sultanate into a golden age. He was chosen precisely because he wouldn't. The ruling emirs needed a puppet, a placeholder, someone to sit quietly while they clawed at each other behind the curtain. In Kujuk, they found the perfect cipher. His reign, if we can call it that, began with parades and proclamations. Gold-leafed edicts were issued in his name. Coins were struck bearing his title. The people of Cairo bowed before a boy who had to be helped onto his horse. In the eyes of the public, this was continuity. The Sultanate abhorred a vacuum, and even a child could fill one, briefly. But behind the Grand Viziers and ceremonial guards, the real power rested with the regent, Emir Qaosun, one of the most ambitious and calculating men in Egypt at the time. Qaosun had engineered Kujuk's rise, and in doing so, placed himself in de facto control of the government. Kujuk signed what Qaosun told him to sign. His speeches were written by others. His appearances, choreographed like a living relic, paraded through a city desperate for stability. For a time, the illusion held, and then, as always in the Mamluk court, the knives came out. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the tides turned, but the truth is, they never stopped turning. Qaosun's power made him enemies, and enemies in the Mamluk system didn't file grievances, they built coalitions. Within months, rival emirs had begun to challenge his authority, whispering that Qaosun was too powerful, too greedy, too dangerous. Some pointed to Kujuk's growing discomfort, though whether that was real or manufactured remains one of history's many blurred lines. By 1342, the pressure had reached a boiling point. Qaosun was overthrown in a swift coup, arrested by his former allies. Without his protector, Kujuk was now a sultan in name only, a child adrift in a palace designed to consume adults. Within weeks, he was formally deposed, removed from the throne in favor of a more acceptable candidate. He returned to private life, such as it was, as a former monarch at 11 years old. Most boys at that age worry about losing friends or misplacing a toy. Kujuk had lost a kingdom. What happened next is where the story tightens into tragedy. Not content with merely removing him from power, the new regime feared Kujuk might be used once again as a figurehead for rebellion. In the Mamluk court, former sultans were not retired. They were threats, even the youngest of them, especially the youngest whose innocence could so easily be weaponized by others. A few months later, Kujuk was dead. Official accounts offer little. The records are sparse, clinical, no proclamations, no ceremonies, just silence. One version says he died of illness. Another, more commonly cited by chroniclers, suggests that he was quietly removed, a political subtraction, neat and bloodless from the outside. What matters isn't how he died, but why no one was surprised. Because by that point, child rulers in the Mamluk system had become a grim tradition, elevated to mask instability, discarded when inconvenient, mourned only in footnotes. Yet Kujuk's short life still casts a long shadow, not for anything he did, but for what he symbolized, the fragility of youthful authority in a system built on violence and pretense. He was born into privilege, yes, palaces and servants, processions and titles, but none of it could shield him from a regime that devoured its own scaffolding. He had the title of Al-Ashraf, meaning the noble, and yet his nobility ended the moment he outlived his usefulness. There's something haunting about a throne that keeps replacing its occupant like a set piece in an endless play, and Kujuk was merely the smallest actor handed the lead for a single tragic act. And still, he wasn't the only teenage monarch chewed up by the very machinery that crowned him. Just years later, the throne would pass to another boy, one slightly older, slightly more independent, and just as doomed, a sultan with a flair for horseback acrobatics, falconry, and poetry, who thought perhaps he could ride his way out of the trap. His name was Al-Muzaffar Hadji. His reign would last longer than Kujuk's, but not by much. 5. Al-Muzaffar Hadji. If Al-Ashraf Kujuk was a child emperor molded by his handlers, then Al-Muzaffar Hadji was what happened when a teenage king believed, mistakenly, that the crown actually belonged to him. Rising to the throne of Mamluk Egypt in 1346, at the age of about 15 or 16, Hadji was not, strictly speaking, a stranger to power. He was the son of Sultan An-Nasir Muhammad, the prolific and politically savvy ruler who had sired more than a dozen sons, many of whom would briefly sit the throne in the decades after his death. It was a line of succession less like a dynasty and more like a revolving door. Hadji was just another royal name in a long queue of brothers and half-brothers, each tossed into the palace furnace to see who could last longer than the smoke. But Hadji had something different. He had charm, energy, and possibly the worst quality a ruler could have in a regime like the Mamluks, a personality. When he became sultan, the palace chroniclers described him with a strange blend of admiration and condescension, as if they couldn't quite believe someone his age was capable of ruling. He was handsome, sharp, and endlessly distracted. Where his predecessors had tiptoed around the power-hungry emirs who ran the government from behind the scenes, Hadji treated them as what they were: obstacles, irritating ones, temporary ones. He preferred his horses. That's not a metaphor. Hadji loved horses. He trained them, raced them, reportedly performed acrobatic stunts while galloping at full speed across the palace grounds. He also kept falcons, enjoyed polo, and, to the dismay of the religious establishment, composed poetry with a flair for metaphor that bordered on the heretical. To his detractors, he was unserious. To his allies, he was just young. To himself, he was invincible. But this was Mamluk Egypt, a place where youth was not forgiven and personality was punished. Hadji's attempts to assert actual control over his government were met with swift resistance. The senior emirs, seasoned survivors of court intrigue, knew exactly what to do with sultans who stepped out of line. They undermined his appointments, ignored his orders, and quietly encouraged dissent within the ranks. Hadji, for his part, didn't help matters by mocking their age and stiffness, openly calling them out in court. He saw them as relics. They saw him as a threat in need of containment. It was a slow, spiraling power struggle, disguised as a teenage tantrum. Still, for a time, Hadji held his ground. He refused to be maneuvered into irrelevance. He continued his sports and artistic indulgences, perhaps as a way of asserting autonomy in a palace that allowed him no real freedom. He wasn't the first sultan to distract himself with falcons and rhyme, but few had done so with quite so much flair. But flair, like fire, draws attention, and in the late Mamluk court, attention was dangerous. By early 1347, rumors were swirling. Whispers that Hadji was mentally unfit, that he was more interested in his horses than in leading the realm, that his behavior was unbecoming of a sultan, a label that conveniently ignored how many of his predecessors had been puppets and how many of his enemies were carving up state power while accusing him of recklessness. Eventually, those whispers solidified into action. The emirs, led by the powerful and patient Emir Sheku, decided Haji had to go. Whether they truly believed he was unfit or simply wanted his throne is immaterial. The point is, they moved, with calculation, with ritual, with the calm detachment of men who had done this before and would do it again. The circumstances of Haji's death remain vague, shaped by the careful erasures of court historians and the awkward silences of official memory. One account suggests he was arrested quietly, under the pretense of rest or protection. Another claims he tried to flee, only to be caught and detained. Whatever the details, by late 1347, Al-Muzaffar Haji was dead, barely 16. No funeral procession worth the title, no mourning decree, just a new name atop the royal proclamations and a new face peering out from the palace balconies. One more sultan in, one more story concluded mid-sentence. And yet Haji lingers, not because he left behind a legacy. He didn't, but because he broke the fourth wall of monarchy. He treated the throne as if it came with actual authority. He believed, perhaps sincerely, that a young man could shape his world instead of being shaped by it. In a regime designed to chew up personality, Haji tried to be personal. And in doing so, he became a problem that had to be deleted. His short life is a mirror held up to every system that prefers silence to self-expression, obedience to energy, compliance to creativity. He might have been a better poet than a politician, a better rider than a ruler, but that doesn't make his death any less unsettling, because in the end he was punished not for failure but for audacity. And the Sultanate, it moved on, as it always did, not by solving problems, but by burying them. The next ruler was another teenager, another temporary figure dressed up in robes too heavy for the age on the birth certificate. His name was As-Salih Ismail. He would outlive Haji by a few short years, but not enough to change the ending. 6. As-Salih Ismail. In the theatre of the Mamluk Sultanate, each sultan is handed the same script: enter young, speak lines written by others, exit quietly. As-Salih Ismail, the 33rd son of the prolific and long-reigning Sultan An-Nasir Muhammad, played his part for a little over a year. He ruled from 1342 to 1345, dying around the age of 19 or 20, old by the standards of Mamluk royal turnover. Yet despite this slightly extended runtime, his reign remains as transient as a smoke signal in a desert wind, seen, acknowledged, and forgotten. But Ismail's story is not one of incompetence. It's a story of survival, of a boy turned sultan walking a tightrope of power he was never meant to cross in the first place. Born into the overcrowded nursery of Nasirid's sons, Ismail's path to the throne was neither obvious nor inevitable. His father had 11 reigns, more wives than anyone could reliably count, and an estate of children sprawling across the palaces like decorative tiles. After An-Nasir's death in 1341, the court devolved into a fratricidal pageant. His sons were installed and removed in rapid succession, none staying long enough to leave more than a coin or two behind. Al-Ashraf Kujuk, Al-Muzaffar Haji, Al-Kamil Shaban. Their names flickered briefly on the political marquee before being extinguished. The throne was a revolving door. Ismail stepped into it simply because he was standing close enough when the music stopped. He was crowned in Cairo at around 16 or 17, a prince elevated by the emirs, not because he was particularly gifted, but because he was acceptable, modest, manageable. The kind of young man whose presence soothed the power brokers but didn't inspire rebellion. A decorative sultan, politically neutered at the root. But Ismail, like many young monarchs before him, made the mistake of having preferences. At first, his rule appeared to be standard issue. The emirs ruled from behind veils of ceremony. The Sultan approved appointments and blinked through council sessions, but cracks began to show almost immediately. Ismail, perhaps emboldened by watching too many of his brothers fall victim to passive compliance, began trying to assert himself. He replaced key officials, he shifted alliances, he attempted, however gently, to push back. In another time or another court, this might have been celebrated as initiative. In the Mamluk palace, it was called overreach. Emir Sheku and Emir Taz, the true arbiters of power at the time, were not in the habit of tolerating unpredictable variables, even when they came wrapped in royal silk. Ismail's independent streak unnerved them. His refusal to be merely ornamental posed a risk. And worse, he was not invisible. He was likable, known among the court for a quiet dignity, for treating palace servants kindly, and for trying to restore some semblance of dignity to a throne that had been reduced to a folding chair. That, ironically, may have been his undoing. Dignity has no place in a regime that thrives on leverage. By mid-1345, the palace began to shift around him. His allies became distant. His requests were delayed, misfiled, ignored. The emirs began holding meetings without him, and the court's ever-present rumour-mongers, a shadowy class of professional survivors, began reporting whispers of betrayal, incompetence, disloyalty. Ismail, like many young rulers before him, didn't fall because he failed. He fell because he stood out. The official records claim he died of illness, and perhaps he did, but even the most generous historians treat this claim with polite skepticism. Illness, after all, is a recurring euphemism in palace transitions. A neat conclusion, a way to close the curtains without revealing the machinery behind the stage. What we know is that he died young, after just over a year on the throne, with no surviving sons and little fanfare. He was buried quietly. The Mamluk chronicles moved on, as they always did, to the next name, the next sultan, the next disappointment. And yet, Asali Ismail's reign lingers in the background as a kind of echo, not of power exercised, but of power withheld. His life reads less like a story and more like a footnote that someone tried to erase, the kind that survives in marginalia, scrawled in the desperate ink of historians trying to recover lost humanity from a parade of forgotten kings. Because, ultimately, that's what Ismail represents, the haunting idea that you can be born royal, groomed for grandeur, and still be powerless in the exact place you were meant to rule. His downfall wasn't theatrical. It wasn't violent or scandalous or even especially memorable to the men who orchestrated it. It was quiet, bureaucratic, an exit filed under regrettable necessity. The most chilling kind of disappearance, the one that leaves no ripples. And still, for all his silence, Ismail is not alone. Because long before the Mamluks turned child sultans into temporary decorations, another empire, farther east, colder in its calculations, sharper in its betrayals, perfected the art of political disposal. There, in the twilight of the Seljuk dynasty, another teenage monarch met a similar fate. His name was Malik Shah II. His throne, like Ismail's, was polished but slippery, and his end came not with a crash, but with the quiet rustle of silk being pulled away from a forgotten body. 7. Malik Shah II. There's a peculiar kind of silence that surrounds the short reigns of teenage kings, like the hush before a sandstorm, where something vast and unseen is moving but hasn't yet made itself known. Malik Shah II ruled for just a few months in 1105, and when he died at roughly 19, he left behind almost no legacy, no surviving reforms, no memorable victories, no great failures. And yet, his story is not empty. It's simply buried beneath the weight of an empire already forgetting him before he was gone. The Seljuk Empire at the time was a house built on tremors. Founded by a Turkic warrior clan that had swept through Persia and Mesopotamia in the 11th century, the Seljuks had gone from nomadic upstarts to imperial overlords in a blink. They controlled vast swaths of land from Anatolia to Central Asia. Their rulers styled themselves as sultans of the East and West, but by the turn of the 12th century, that house of conquest had begun to fracture. Succession, as always, was the fault line. The great Sultan Malik Shah Bafi had ruled with authority and brilliance, holding the empire together through a delicate balancing act of regional governors, loyal generals, and bureaucratic vision. When he died in 1092, the Seljuk realm didn't collapse outright. It split like river ice. His sons and relatives began to tear at the boundaries of the state like wolves fighting over a carcass. In that chaos, the empire's cohesion depended not on strength, but on luck, and luck, by the time Malik Shah II arrived, was in short supply. He wasn't the first to try salvaging the throne. The years between Malik Shah I and Malik Shah II were filled with brief, sometimes overlapping reigns: Mahmud I, Baqi Aruk, Muhammad the Itapar. Each represented a different camp within the royal family, a different regional power base. Civil war had become institutionalized. The Sultanate wasn't so much inherited as wrestled for. The idea of a stable succession had withered, replaced by a grim roulette of alliances and betrayals. When Malik Shah II ascended the throne in Baghdad, he was barely out of adolescence and already hemmed in. His claim was nominally supported by the Abbasid Caliph, an endorsement that still carried symbolic weight, but real power lay in the provinces, where ambitious atabegs and rival sultans ruled like kings in their own right. To many, Malik Shah II was just another temporary actor in a role that had lost all meaning. Still, there was a flicker of possibility. He was named after his grandfather, the great Malik Shah IV, and some hoped he might inherit more than just the name. A young, untested monarch could theoretically be molded into a consensus figure, someone the warring Seljuk factions might rally behind in exhaustion, if not loyalty. It had happened before in history. Sometimes peace arrives not because everyone wins, but because everyone's too tired to keep losing. But this was not one of those times. From the beginning, Malik Shah II was surrounded by contradiction. He was called Sultan by some, Pretender by others. His court issued proclamations in his name, while rival princes issued their own. To his face, courtiers bowed. Behind his back, they wrote letters to his enemies. His reign was like watching a shadow try to stand upright. Then, just months into his rule, he died. The cause remains uncertain. Illness, assassination, political maneuvering, or some combination of all three. The records are terse, as though even the chroniclers found it inconvenient to pause their narratives for someone whose reign barely registered. No fanfare, no mourning, just a note: Malik Shah II, son of Mahmud I, passed, and the Sultanate, ever indifferent, moved on. But buried in this brief flickering moment is something worth remembering. Malik Shah II ruled at a time when legitimacy was dissolving, when thrones were not seats of power, but illusions maintained by parchment and coins. He was handed the reins of a dynasty in decline and told to pretend he was steering. It's a familiar pattern in dynastic history. Youth offered not as a solution, but as a placeholder, a distraction, something to delay the reckoning. What makes Malik Shah II's story haunting isn't what he did, but what he wasn't allowed to do. He never had the chance to try and fail. His life was written as an epilogue before it even began. And yet, within that silence, there's a soft resonance of a boy king walking through palace halls once filled with real power, now echoing with the footsteps of ghosts. His death may have gone unnoticed by history, but it signaled something larger, that the Seljuk Empire, once held together by vision and strength, was now a stage haunted by forgotten actors. And Malik Shah II, by vanishing so quietly, reminds us that sometimes the most devastating tragedies are not the violent ones, but the ones that leave no mark at all. Yet even among sultans forgotten by their own empires, some left a more vivid trace, not because they ruled long or ruled well, but because their downfall was wrapped in ritual and revenge. In the Delhi Sultanate, far to the east, another boy would inherit a title he couldn't command. His name was Ala ud-Din Masood, and his reign would prove that even in distant lands, the crown remained a gilded trap for the young. 7 stories in, and somehow the crowns keep getting heavier. If you've made it this far, you're clearly fluent in royal tragedy, so take a second to subscribe if you haven't already. It's the simplest way to keep these strange histories coming. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it over there? Are you binging this at 2 p.m. in Berlin or 2 a.m. in Jakarta, pretending you'll go to bed after just one more? Don't worry, we've all been there. 8. Ala ud-Din Masood. It is a strange irony that some kings become legends for what they build, others for what they destroy, and a rare few for simply existing at the wrong time. Ala ud-Din Masood, the 7th ruler of the Mamluk dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate, falls firmly into the last category. His name does not evoke architectural wonders or sweeping military campaigns. He did not expand the empire, nor did he lose it in dramatic fashion. He barely had time to do anything at all, and yet his short, murky reign, likely from around age 14 to 19, stands as a cautionary tale of power misused and youth mishandled in a court where being sultan meant little and surviving sultan meant even less. Masood came to the throne in 1242, in the shadow of his predecessor and cousin Rukn ud-Din Firuz, whose reign had ended in spectacular collapse after only a few months. Firuz had lost control of the empire through negligence and excess, 2 words that would echo hauntingly throughout Masood's own reign. But where Firuz had failed through arrogance, Masood would fail through indifference. Let's set the stage. 13th century Delhi was a place of deep contradiction. On the surface, the Delhi Sultanate was a rising power, a Muslim monarchy ruling over a vast and diverse Indian subcontinent. Its rulers, former Turkic slaves turned emperors, had clawed their way to power through military prowess, strategic alliances, and ruthless ambition. But beneath the polished court rituals and Persian poetry, the Sultanate was a web of shifting allegiances, palace conspiracies, and barely subdued provincial rebellions. When Masood was raised to the throne by powerful nobles, it was not because anyone believed in his leadership. It was because they needed a sultan to legitimize their own power. The assassination of Sultan Razia, one of the few truly capable rulers of the era and the only woman to ever sit on the throne of Delhi, had left the empire adrift. The court was splintered, the military restless, and the nobility desperate for a puppet they could manipulate without resistance. Masood fit the mold perfectly. Young, untested, and presumably pliable. But unlike some of the child rulers who meekly followed orders, Masood took his appointment as permission, not to govern, but to indulge. Almost immediately, chroniclers note a pattern. Masood disappeared into the inner chambers of the palace, surrounding himself with flatterers and entertainers. He developed a reputation for lavishness, for prioritizing his pleasures over his duties. His court became a theater of distraction, filled with music, poetry, wine, and indulgent spectacle. Not uncommon for a medieval monarch, and yet Masood was not a monarch with a foundation to stand on. He had no military legacy, no charismatic lineage, no loyal power base. All he had was the temporary favor of nobles who were growing increasingly embarrassed by the boy they'd chosen. And to be fair, Masood was still a teenager, 15, 16, perhaps 17 at most during the core of his rule. Any child handed the symbols of absolute power at that age, the robes, the sword, the coinage stamped with their name, might have fallen for the illusion that they were truly untouchable. But in the Delhi court, illusion was fatal. The nobles, especially the powerful Turkish slave officers known as the Cihalgani or the 40, had long held real power behind the throne. Masud's frivolity gave them the perfect excuse to act. By 1246, after only 4 years on the throne, the same men who had installed him began plotting to remove him. This wasn't revolution, it was maintenance. The final straw seems to have been Masud's increasing autonomy in matters of appointment and favour. The young sultan, perhaps tired of playing the role of ceremonial king, began asserting preferences. He promoted courtiers outside the accepted inner circle. He questioned certain financial decisions, small acts but threatening in their implications. The nobles, seeing the spark of independence in someone they'd intended to keep ornamental, decided it was time, and so, just like that, Ala-ud-Din Masud was deposed. The court announced a new sultan, Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud, a more malleable figure, at least in theory, and Masud was removed from power. Whether he was immediately executed, quietly imprisoned, or left to fade into irrelevance is still debated by historians. What is agreed upon is that his story ended abruptly and without much mourning. But here's the uncomfortable truth buried in this footnote of history. Ala-ud-Din Masud was likely no more foolish or self-indulgent than many of the rulers who came before or after him. What doomed him wasn't incompetence, it was timing. He reigned during a moment when the empire needed strength and stability, but had only factions and fear. He was a teenager set loose in a collapsing house, blamed when the ceiling caved in, and quickly swept aside when a new tenant needed the room. His reign is a reminder that monarchs, especially young ones, are often judged not by their actions, but by their usefulness. Masud wasn't executed for misrule. He was removed because he stopped being convenient. And yet, his ghost lingers in the architecture of the Delhi court, in the ruined palaces and faded manuscripts that whisper of a time when kingship was less about ruling and more about surviving the room you walked into. Masud did not survive it, but he also wasn't the last. Because elsewhere, far to the northeast, across the sea, in a land of shrines and steel, another boy emperor would inherit a kingdom built on myth, only to find himself dragged into a war no one prepared him for. His name was Antoku, and his reign would end not with dismissal, but with the cold embrace of the sea. 9. Emperor Antoku. In the mythology of Japan, the emperor is not just a ruler, he is a living god. A descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, whose bloodline stretches unbroken through time, impervious to war, politics, or death. But myth makes no promises about age, and it certainly makes no exceptions for children. Emperor Antoku was crowned at the age of 2 and dead by the age of 6 or 7, caught between the glory of divine descent and the cold, chaotic machinery of feudal warfare. His reign, if we can call it that, unfolded during one of the most cataclysmic periods in Japanese history, the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185. It was a brutal 5-year civil conflict between two aristocratic clans, the Taira, also known as Heike, and the Minamoto, also known as Genji, both vying not just for control of the imperial court, but for the soul of the nation itself. And standing at the heart of this storm was a toddler, dressed in imperial robes far too heavy for his frame, paraded through court ceremonies like a symbol everyone worshipped and no one protected. Antoku was born in 1178, a time when the Taira clan held immense power in Kyoto. His mother was the daughter of Taira no Kiyomori, the clan's iron-willed patriarch and Japan's de facto ruler. When the sitting emperor fell ill, or rather when it became politically advantageous for him to fall ill, Kiyomori maneuvered his infant grandson onto the throne. It was a textbook political move. Place your bloodline on the throne, control the nation from behind a silk curtain. The child emperor, Antoku, was 2. He would never know a world not already determined for him. But power in 12th century Japan was brittle. The aristocracy's rituals masked the fact that real authority lay in the countryside, with warrior clans and provincial governors. And among them, the Minamoto were not content to watch their rivals rule. When they rose up in rebellion, the Genpei War began, and the imperial court fractured like a cracked mirror. At first, the Taira held their ground. They had control of the emperor, the court, and the capital, but holding power and wielding it effectively are two very different things. As the war dragged on, the Minamoto forces gained momentum, pushing the Taira westward in retreat. By 1183, Kyoto had fallen to the Minamoto. The court, desperate to maintain the illusion of continuity, installed a rival emperor, but the Taira would not surrender their prize. They fled with Antoku, carrying not only the child but also the imperial regalia, the mirror, the sword, and the jewel, sacred treasures believed to grant divine legitimacy. It was a strange image. The sunborn emperor reduced to a refugee, a holy child bobbing on the back of a horse, flanked by warriors with mud-stained armor and fading loyalty. Antoku wasn't old enough to understand strategy or succession, but his very presence was a weapon. To the Taira, he was their last shred of legitimacy. To the Minamoto, he was a rallying cry. The child king held hostage by rebels. To both, he was irreplaceable, but to neither was he safe. In 1185, the two forces met for a final reckoning at the Battle of Dan no Ura, a naval clash in the treacherous currents of the Shimonoseki Strait. It was the kind of battle that feels mythic even in real time. War drums echoing over the water, arrows blotting out the sun, samurai leaping between boats like ghosts from the No stage. And at the center of it, aboard one of the Taira ships, was Antoku. He would not survive the day. There are no simple endings in this story, not for the Taira, not for the Minamoto, and certainly not for a child too young to read the poems written in his name. The battle turned decisively in favor of the Minamoto when a key Taira commander defected mid-fight. Chaos erupted. The Taira, realizing defeat was imminent, chose ritual over surrender. Chroniclers describe a sea turned black with armor and red with banners, and somewhere in that confusion, Antoku vanished beneath the waves. Official accounts, especially the later ones, claim that his grandmother, in a moment of devotion or desperation, carried the boy into the sea rather than allow him to be captured. Whether this is literal, symbolic, or sanitized history is unclear. What matters is that the emperor drowned, a godchild reclaimed by the elements, the sacred sword lost with him, the dynasty shattered. But perhaps the most tragic detail of all is this: Antoku never ruled. Not truly. His reign was ceremonial, his life directional. He was a flag, a banner, a figurehead carried from shrine to battlefield like a talisman. And when he died, the Taira died with him. The Genpei War ended. The Minamoto claimed power. The shogunate was born. And the imperial line, that ancient unbroken chain, was reduced to a ceremonial echo. In the centuries since, Antoku's memory has been preserved in shrines and ballads, most famously in The Tale of the Heike, where he is portrayed as a tragic divine victim. Some say his spirit still lingers in the sea, honored by fishermen who toss offerings into the tide. Others argue that he was the last true emperor before the age of warriors reshaped Japan forever. But one thing is certain: he died too soon. Not just in years, but in meaning. He was a child handed the mantle of divinity and asked to survive a civil war. And in that way, he stands in silent kinship with every young monarch torn between symbolism and survival. And as Japan mourned a drowned god, another child emperor was growing up in the shadow of a different civil war. This one unfolding not on ships, but in scrolls, temples, and palace corridors. His name was Chukyo, and unlike Antoku, he would live just long enough to feel the weight of the throne. before being crushed by it. 10. Emperor Chukyo. In the long scroll of Japanese imperial history, where emperors are born into poetry and crowned with ceremony, some names barely leave an ink stroke. Chukyo is one of them, a child emperor who reigned for mere weeks in the year 1221 and died around the age of 15, quietly erased from the imperial record for over 5 centuries. His name was officially forgotten, and his memory filed away in the bureaucratic dust of history until it was, much later, reluctantly restored. But even then, the silence surrounding him lingered like a carefully folded kimono no one dared to wear again. To understand Chukyo's story is to understand how quickly a boy's life can be transformed into an instrument, and how swiftly that instrument can be discarded once the tune changes. He was born Prince Kaninari, the son of Emperor Juntoku, and a direct descendant of the imperial bloodline that traced its origin, as all emperors in Japan do, to the sun goddess herself. It was a prestigious lineage, sacred, ceremonial, and increasingly irrelevant in the real power dynamics of Kamakura-era Japan. By the early 13th century, the imperial court in Kyoto had become a beautifully painted cage. The true rulers were the Kamakura shogunate, a military government headquartered far to the east, headed by the Hojo regents. The emperor could chant sutras, write poems, and bless the harvest, but real power belonged to warriors. Still, the emperors hadn't completely accepted this arrangement. In 1221, Emperor Juntoku, Chukyo's father, attempted to reassert the supremacy of the throne by launching the Jokyu War, a bold but doomed rebellion against the Kamakura shogunate. It was, in hindsight, a noble fantasy, the court trying to turn back the tide of militarized governance with a declaration and a prayer. The court mobilized what forces it could, relying mostly on loyal nobles and sympathetic Buddhist temples. The Hojo, however, responded with military precision, sending their eastern armies to crush the rebellion within weeks. Kyoto fell, the rebellion collapsed, and in the middle of this geopolitical collapse stood a teenage boy, suddenly called upon to wear the chrysanthemum crown. Here's where the story shifts from war epic to quiet tragedy. As the rebellion unraveled, Emperor Juntoku was forced to abdicate. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to preserve the illusion of imperial continuity, his young son was elevated to the throne as Emperor Chukyo. It was a ceremonial move, not a military one, a symbolic transition that pretended the court still controlled its own destiny. Chukyo, around 15 at the time, was made emperor in the middle of a siege, a coronation surrounded by betrayal and panic. He reigned for 78 days, and in those days there was no peace, no consolidation, no ceremony that wasn't wrapped in fear. His name was used on documents, his authority cited in appeals to remaining court loyalists. But Chukyo himself remained largely passive, a boy placed on a throne that had lost its foundation. When the Hojo armies reached Kyoto, the decision came quickly. Chukyo was deposed, the imperial court purged, and Emperor Go Horikawa, a more palatable figure for the new regime, was installed in his place. Chukyo's father, Juntoku, was exiled to the distant island of Sado, where he spent the rest of his life in monastic isolation. As for Chukyo, his fate was quieter, but arguably crueler in a different way. He was simply erased. The Hojo regime, uninterested in any reminder of the Jokyu rebellion, omitted Chukyo's name from the official list of emperors. For centuries, Japanese imperial records skipped over him entirely, going from Juntoku to Go Horikawa without pause, as if Chukyo's reign, and perhaps his very existence, had been a glitch in the imperial code. Even his death, at around 15, was largely unremarked upon. Whether he died from illness, neglect, or quiet disposal is not known. What is known is that he died young, in obscurity, after having been briefly weaponized by a desperate father and discarded by a victorious enemy. He was a placeholder emperor, born into glory, used as a tool, and buried in silence. And for more than 500 years that silence held. Not until 1870, in the dawn of the Meiji era, when Japan began modernizing and retroactively resacralizing its imperial institution, was Chukyo's name restored to the official list of emperors. The court, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of bureaucratic fastidiousness, finally acknowledged him as the 85th Emperor of Japan. It was a posthumous act of reconciliation, more symbolic than restorative. Chukyo's spirit, if it lingered, had waited centuries for the apology. But what lingers more than the paperwork is the question: how many other child rulers were swallowed by politics before they could even figure out what power meant? Chukyo's story is not unique in its tragedy. It is unique only in its erasure. For nearly all of Japanese history, it was as if he had never been. And yet, just a few decades later, another child emperor would rise, not in the tranquil halls of Kyoto, but in a crumbling court under siege by an existential threat. This time, the boy would not be erased, but he would be hunted. Dragged from place to place across the southern provinces of China, sickly and exhausted, as Mongol armies closed in from all sides. His name was Duanzong. His empire was already dying, and all he could do was run. 11. Emperor Duanzong of Song history rarely pauses for the frightened, and it certainly doesn't wait for children. When Emperor Duanzong of Song ascended the crumbling throne in 1276, he was just 6 years old, a child born into silk and incense, yet destined to spend his brief reign running barefoot through rain-soaked mountains, fleeing from the world's most efficient empire, the Mongols. His life was a slow-motion retreat, a story not of battles fought, but of cities lost, brothers mourned, and an empire unraveling beneath the feet of a boy who could barely hold a scepter, let alone wield it. His birth name was Zhao Shi, and when he came into the world in 1269, the Southern Song dynasty was already living on borrowed time. The once mighty empire, which had ruled southern China for over a century, was cornered, literally. The Mongols had taken the north, the west had fallen. What remained was a shrinking stretch of land around Linan, modern-day Hangzhou, a decadent capital with gardens that bloomed while armies starved outside its walls. The court held poetry contests and tea ceremonies, while emissaries from Kublai Khan drew closer. When Duanzong's older brother, the child Emperor Gong of Song, surrendered to the Mongols in 1276, the dynasty was effectively dead. Gong, just 5 years old, was captured and carted off to the Yuan court, renamed and re-educated in the Mongol fashion, a symbol of submission dressed in silk. But not everyone in the Song court was willing to fold so easily. A few loyal officials, led by the steadfast Lu Xiufu and the ever-resilient Zhang Shijie, refused to accept the end. They fled Linan with the emperor's younger brother, Zhao Xu, whisking him away in secret deep into the southern countryside. The boy was crowned in exile as Emperor Duanzong aboard a boat. It was the beginning of one of the most tragic and desperate fugitive reigns in imperial history. The image is cinematic and miserable. A 6-year-old emperor, dressed in robes of authority, carried through war-torn provinces by tired generals and scholar officials who read Confucian texts by candlelight while calculating which city might fall next. The court became a caravan, sometimes at sea, sometimes hiding in mountain temples, rarely in the same place for more than a week. Each time they stopped, they raised the imperial banner. Each time they moved, they left behind more territory, more people, more hope. Duanzong's court in exile tried to function like a real government. Edicts were issued in his name. Titles were handed out to loyal families. Refugees were granted safe passage wherever possible. But it was all symbolism, sacred gestures performed in a crumbling theatre. The Mongols, efficient and relentless, were less interested in pageantry. They wanted control. They wanted closure. and they were closing in. Duanzong himself was not a ruler in any traditional sense. At 6 or 7, he could barely read the documents prepared for his seal. He depended entirely on the men around him. Lu Xiufu, who served as a father figure and political guide, Zhang Shiji, who commanded the remnants of the Song Navy, and the few remaining imperial loyalists who still believed in the mandate of heaven, even as heaven turned its gaze elsewhere. But for all their loyalty, they couldn't protect him from the weather, the stress, or the sheer exhaustion of living in constant retreat. And that, more than any battle, is what finally broke the boy. In 1278, after a particularly brutal storm at sea during a relocation between hideouts, Duanzong fell ill. Some say it was pneumonia, others malaria, or simply a fever caught from days soaked in cold rain. The sources disagree on the medical cause, but not on the circumstances. The boy emperor had spent the night drenched and shivering, huddled in the hold of a storm-tossed vessel, coughing quietly while the last loyalists plotted their next impossible move. He never recovered. He died not in a palace, but in a borrowed room in Gangzhou, a minor city already under threat. His funeral was rushed, the mourning brief. There was no time. The Mongols were still advancing. But before his small body had even cooled, his younger brother, Zhao Bing, just 6 years old, was crowned emperor in his place. Because even in defeat, the Song dynasty needed a figurehead. Even in exile, it clung to the idea that the dragon throne must be occupied, even if only by a child who didn't yet understand why his brother was suddenly gone. Duanzong was buried quietly, with what dignity could be spared. The court moved again, the escape continued, the dynasty still refused to die, though its last breaths were clearly numbered. And what remains of Duanzong? No great decree, no military order, no sweeping reform, only the image of a boy in imperial regalia, clutching at the hems of his caretakers as the empire collapsed behind him. His story is one of survival deferred, the tragedy of a child too young to fight, too fragile to lead, and too sacred to abandon. Yet even in his death, the pattern continued. The Song would install one last emperor, his younger brother, in a final gesture of resistance, a last ember in a drowned fire. His name was Zhao Bing. His reign would last even less than Duanzong's, and when it ended, so too would the Song dynasty. Not with a rebellion, not with a negotiation, but with a final, irreversible plunge into history. 12. Emperor Bing of Song. By the time Zhao Bing was declared Emperor of Song in 1278, the dynasty he inherited was already dead in every meaningful way except metaphor. There were no cities left to rule, no palace left to stand in, no treasury to fund resistance. The imperial seal had long since become a talisman of nostalgia, not power. And yet, for one final year, the Song dynasty endured, not as a state, not as a government, but as an idea. And Zhao Bing, a boy of about 6 or 7, became the last living embodiment of that idea. An emperor in name, a refugee in practice, and a martyr by the end. He was the younger brother of Emperor Duanzong, the child monarch who had fled south through storms, sieges and starvation before succumbing to illness in a borrowed city. Zhao Bing had watched his brother waste away in the aftermath of a storm just days before his own reluctant coronation. The officials around him, desperate, exhausted and increasingly hollow-eyed, needed a new emperor immediately. Not for strategy, not for diplomacy, but for the rituals. The dynasty required a living son of heaven to exist, even if that son was too small to lift the ceremonial sword. So they put the dragon robe on a 6-year-old, again. The final phase of the Southern Song dynasty was less a reign than a retreat on loop. The court, if one could still call it that, wandered across southern coastal provinces, a caravan of dignity pursued by an empire with no appetite for symbolism. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty had conquered the north, secured the middle, and now aimed to extinguish the last pocket of resistance that refused to admit it had already lost. The Song royal family, trailed by scattered soldiers, loyal bureaucrats, and what remained of the navy, moved from hiding place to hiding place like a ghost chased by dogs. Zhao Bing's days were filled with ritual and relocation. He was expected to carry the weight of 5 centuries of Song legacy on shoulders still too narrow for a ceremonial robe. Portraits depict him as quiet and delicate, which is to say, unprepared. His caretakers, especially Lu Xiufu, the scholar official turned military guardian, became his protectors, tutors, and in time, the last remaining adults still pretending that this performance had meaning. They knew the end was coming. Everyone did. By 1279, the Song court had retreated to the edge of the world, the coastal town of Yamen in present-day Guangdong. There, on the rocky promontories and narrow harbours, they staged their last stand. It wasn't a military decision. It was symbolic. If they were to fall, they would fall with ceremony, in uniform, with incense burning. The court was reduced to a floating government, ministers living on ships, proclamations written in ink that would soon be washed away by salt water. The Yuan Navy found them. The Battle of Yamen was not so much a battle as an annihilation. The Song fleet, numbering in the hundreds, was chained together in the harbour to prevent desertion. It was meant to signal unity, resolve, divine defiance. In practice, it ensured that when one ship burned, they all did. The UN forces attacked in waves using superior numbers and strategy. There was nowhere to run. Some accounts say Zhao Bing watched the battle from the command ship, sitting beneath a ceremonial canopy, unaware or perhaps uncomprehending of what it meant. He was not a strategist. He was a symbol, a crown held aloft in the hopes that heaven might change its mind. It didn't. As the UN forces closed in, the final defenders of the Song court knew what was expected of them. Lu Xiufu, now acting as chancellor, gathered the last remnants of the imperial family. Some officials burned their robes and court seals. Others prepared to die in ways that would preserve what dignity they could salvage from a collapsing order. There was no room for surrender, not after everything, not with the child emperor aboard. At the climax of the battle, with flames behind him and enemy ships ahead, Lu Xiufu reportedly turned to Zhao Bing and whispered a prayer. Then he picked up the boy and stepped into the sea. The records compiled years later by Song loyalists and UN historians alike agree on the result, if not the details. The last emperor of the Song dynasty, barely 7 years old, drowned that day in the waters off Yamen. His body was never recovered. His throne, long reduced to driftwood, disappeared beneath the tide. The dynasty, which had lasted over 300 years, ended not with a signed treaty or a palace coup, but with a child and a wave. And yet, Zhao Bing's death was not just an end, it was a signal. The Song resistance, already unraveling, collapsed completely. Remaining officials either surrendered, fled into the mountains, or vanished into private life. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan now ruled all of China, unified, vast and total, but it had no more emperors to chase. Zhao Bing became a kind of ghost in the national imagination, the boy who symbolized loyalty beyond reason, duty beyond survival, and the unbearable cost of refusing to surrender a dying ideal. His brief ceremonial reign became a moral parable about the dangers of absolutism, the cruelty of court expectations, and the helplessness of children caught between dynasties. And even as the sea swallowed the last sovereign of the Song, another boy in another empire was preparing to mount his own doomed ascent, not on a ship, but in a palace of painted screens and secret corridors. His name was Jian Shao, and he would not flee. He would sit the throne of the Han dynasty, briefly, blindly, until his own family decided he had seen too much. 13. Emperor Qian Shao of Han history tends to remember the Han dynasty as one of China's golden ages, an era of brilliant scholars, stable governance, Silk Road expansion, and a legacy so enduring that even today the dominant ethnic group in China calls itself the Han. But buried deep within that gleaming lineage lies a darker, quieter tale, one that rarely finds its way into textbooks or tourist plaques. It is the story of Emperor Qian Shao, a boy who was made emperor around the age of 8 or 9, whose brief reign was built on a lie, and who was quietly removed when he began asking the wrong questions. Qian Shao was never supposed to be remembered, and for a long time he wasn't. He was born sometime around 193 BCE into the imperial household, a world that, despite its grandeur, operated less like a family and more like a machine. The Han court, particularly in its early decades, was a place where emperors were installed and discarded according to the shifting loyalties of regents, dowagers, and ministers. Power was not inherited. It was maneuvered into, often by those with no intention of yielding it once they'd placed a child on the throne. That was exactly the role young Qian Shao played. His predecessor, Emperor Hui of Han, had died in 188 BCE after a relatively short and unremarkable reign. Hui had been the son of the formidable Empress Lu Ji, a woman as shrewd as she was ruthless, who continued to consolidate power even after her husband, the founding Emperor Liu Bang, died. With Hui gone, she had a problem: succession, not just who would succeed, but how to maintain her grip on the empire once someone did. Her solution was cold and efficient. Qian Shao was declared the new emperor in 188 BCE, at just about 8 years old. He was presented to the court as the biological son of the late Emperor Hui and a palace consort, a plausible enough story wrapped in ritual and official decrees. But the truth was murkier. The boy was not Hui's son. He may have been the child of another prince, or a minor noble, or simply someone plucked from the extended royal family tree to play the role of heir. In either case, it was a performance. Empress Lu adopted him, stamped him with legitimacy, and placed him on the dragon throne, not because he had a claim, but because he had no power. And for a while, the system worked. As emperor, Qian Shao was a ceremonial figure. He presided over rituals, appeared at banquets, and signed documents prepared for him by Lu's council. The empire continued to function. Taxes were collected, borders defended, grain stored. Empress Lu ruled from behind the veil, issuing decrees in the emperor's name while eliminating anyone who questioned her authority. Ministers were promoted or executed based on loyalty, not merit. Dissent was met with silence, or in some cases permanent disappearance. Qian Shao, still a child, grew up inside this manufactured world. He wore robes of authority, learned palace etiquette, and practiced his calligraphy beneath silk banners proclaiming the divine mandate of his rule. But he ruled nothing. He was, in essence, a prop. But children do not stay quiet forever, and eventually Qian Shao began to ask questions. Sometime around his teenage years, the records do not specify exactly, Qian Shao reportedly began to inquire about his birth mother. He had grown up believing he was the son of Emperor Hui and Empress Lu, but the whispers in the palace, the half-truths of servants, and perhaps a few loose remarks from drunk officials had painted a different picture. He wanted answers, and when those were not forthcoming, he began to voice anger, frustration, a dangerous thing for a boy emperor in a palace of spies. According to the official histories, written decades later, long after all the players were dead, Qian Shao became disrespectful to the Empress Dowager. He was resentful, even threatening. Some versions claim he expressed a desire for revenge upon learning that his real mother had been executed by Empress Lu, likely to prevent any inconvenient loyalties or political claims. Whether these accounts are accurate, exaggerated, or fabricated altogether is impossible to know. What matters is what happened next. Qian Shao disappeared. In 184 BCE, after roughly 4 years on the throne, he was officially deposed. The reason given was illness, a convenient euphemism that echoes across dynastic histories. The court announced that Qian Shao was no longer fit to rule, and a new child emperor, Ho Shao, was installed in his place. The machine had ejected one cog and replaced it with another. No trial, no explanation, no outcry. Some sources suggest that Qian Shao was imprisoned, kept in isolation in a palace annex until he died, either from neglect or by deliberate order. Others say he was quietly executed, with only a handful of officials informed. Either way, the effect was the same. The name Qian Shao was scrubbed from public memory, and the regime carried on without him. But behind the efficiency of this removal lies something more disturbing. The boy never had a chance. He was chosen because he was powerless. He was removed because he tried to understand that power, and his death, likely quiet, likely lonely, was not the result of failure, but curiosity. Qian Shao's story is not one of policy or conquest. It is the story of a child born into the wrong chapter of history, used by those more powerful, and discarded the moment he began to see the edges of the stage he had been placed upon. He reigned for just 4 years. He left no children, no writings, no monuments, only a warning. And while Qian Shao's fate was chilling, it was not unique. The very boy who replaced him, Emperor Hu Shao, another child emperor, another ceremonial figure, would follow the same path. Seated, silenced, and ultimately erased. Because in the palaces of ancient China, even emperors could be expendable, especially the young ones who mistook their crown for actual power. 14. Emperor Hu Shao of Han. There are figures in history who rule with vision, others with force, and still others who are remembered purely because they were the final flicker before darkness. Emperor Hu Shao of Han doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. He was not a visionary, nor a tyrant, nor even a cautionary tale in the traditional sense. He was instead a placeholder, a name given to a boy by a regime that had no intention of letting him grow into anything more. If Emperor Qian Shao's story was one of deception followed by silence, Hu Shao's was worse. His entire reign, from the moment he was crowned until the moment he was erased, was a performance in which he didn't even get to choose his lines. He was the second of Empress Lu Ji's imperial puppets, and his fate was sealed before he ever touched the Jade Seal of State. It is important to understand that Empress Lu's control over the early Han dynasty was not just a matter of influence, it was absolute. After the death of her husband, Emperor Gaozu, Liu Bang, and later their son, Emperor Hui, Lu Ji transformed the imperial court into a chessboard on which she moved every piece. Ministers served at her pleasure, princes lived or died by her suspicions, and when it came to the throne itself, she saw no need to pretend it belonged to anyone else, least of all a child too young to read the edicts issued in his name. Qian Shao had asked too many questions. He had wondered aloud about his birth mother. He had grown curious, a dangerous trait in an emperor who was never meant to think for himself. And so, in 184 BCE, he was quietly removed. In his place, Lu installed another child, one whose origins were even more carefully obscured, whose bloodline was more ambiguous, and whose usefulness depended entirely on remaining quiet. That boy was Hu Shao. His given name is lost to history. Even the title Hu Shao, meaning later Shao, a generic label, seems designed to flatten him into the scenery. It was not a name intended to be remembered. It was a placeholder, like Act 2 in a tragedy that everyone knew would end the same way. At the time of his enthronement, Hu Shao was around 10 years old. Like his predecessor, he was presented as the legitimate son of Emperor Hui. though few at court believed the claim. It was another fiction wrapped in ceremony, an act of political theatre meant to preserve the illusion of continuity while the real power remained with Lu Ji and her allies. The boy was crowned with full imperial fanfare, music, proclamations, sacrifices. The dragon robe was fitted, the ancestral rites were performed, and yet all of it rang hollow. Because everyone knew the truth, Hu Shao did not issue orders. He did not review military reports, pass reforms, or meet foreign envoys. He sat on a throne, nodded when prompted, and signed edicts prepared by Lu's secretariat. When he spoke, it was scripted. When he moved, it was escorted. He lived behind silk screens in gilded captivity, a child ghost occupying the empire's most sacred space. The court around him was equally artificial. Ministers who had once served under Gaozu now bowed to a child they did not respect. Generals swore loyalty to a name, not a person. The bureaucracy carried on. Grain collected, roads repaired, laws enforced, but the legitimacy of the dynasty had frayed. Everyone was waiting for Empress Lu to die. Until then, the empire held its breath. Lu Ji, ever meticulous, continued to consolidate her grip on power. She placed members of her family into key positions, promoting Lu clan relatives over Liu family princes. It was a bold and deliberate move, one that broke with the dynastic principle that power must remain in the founding lineage. She seemed to believe that if she could secure enough posts with loyal kin, the Lu family could inherit the Han itself. But power secured through fear is always borrowed. When Empress Lu died in 180 BCE, the spell broke. It happened quickly. With Lu gone, the old guard moved. Loyalists to the Liu imperial family, led by the cunning and well-connected Chen Ping and Zhou Bo, staged a coup. The Lu clan was purged, swiftly and with terrifying efficiency. Relatives were executed. Officials were removed. Palaces once occupied by the Lus were stormed and sealed. The message was clear. The Han would return to its founding family, or it would end in flames. And in the middle of all this, there sat Hu Shao, no longer useful, no longer protected. The ministers, once deferential, now regarded him with cold calculation. He was, after all, not a true heir. His parentage was unclear. His legitimacy rested entirely on the authority of a woman who was now dead and denounced. Worse still, there were whispers, persistent and damning, that Hu Shao had known about the fate of his predecessor, Qian Shao, that he had been told what happened to the last boy who asked about his mother, and that he had learned to keep quiet in a house built on silence. The whispers turned into accusations. The accusations turned into a verdict. Hu Shao was deposed. Some accounts say he was executed. Others suggest he was quietly placed under house arrest, fading into obscurity before dying in exile. What no source disputes is the ease with which he was removed. There was no popular backlash, no protest in the streets. The empire simply replaced him, like a curtain drawn closed on an unpopular act. Emperor Wen, a distant relative of the Liu family, was installed in his place, a new beginning, though one still haunted by the memory of what had come before. Hu Shao's story rarely gets its own chapter. He's a footnote in a larger narrative about Empress Lu's tyranny, a minor player in the drama of Han's succession. But behind that obscurity is something deeply unsettling. A child handed absolute power on paper, denied any real agency in practice, and discarded the moment his usefulness expired. He never ruled. He was ruled through, and yet his life speaks volumes about the fragility of power when separated from legitimacy, about the dangers of silence enforced by fear, and about the human cost of court intrigue disguised as divine order. Hu Shao was not the first boy emperor to be destroyed by the adults who elevated him, and he would not be the last, because just a few decades later, another infant would sit the throne, Emperor Shang of Han. whose reign would be so brief and whose life so short that he would pass through history like a breath in winter, a ruler before he could walk, a memory before he could speak. 15. Emperor Shang of Han, Liu Long. There's a moment in every long-lived dynasty when its rituals begin to outweigh its realities, when the ceremonies carry on even though the meaning behind them has withered, when crowns are passed down not with the force of purpose but with the hush of habit. That moment had long since arrived for the Western Han dynasty by the time Emperor Shang, born Liu Long, was placed on the throne. He was around 1 year old, maybe 2, and he died not long after. His reign is one of the shortest in Chinese history, and yet it reveals something chilling about how far a system will go to protect the illusion of stability, even if it means dressing an infant in the robes of an emperor. Liu Long was the youngest son of Emperor He of Han, who had reigned from 88 to 105 CE. When he died suddenly in 105, a succession crisis began, or rather was manufactured. Emperor He had several sons, but his favored heir, Liu Sheng, had died young. That left Liu Long and his elder half-brother Liu Hu, the future Emperor An, as the remaining contenders. In a court where power did not flow smoothly, but instead seeped through family alliances and factions, the appointment of a successor was rarely about the most capable, especially when one candidate was a baby and the other a teenager. The Dowager Empress Deng Sui, one of the most powerful women in Han history, made the decision. She chose Liu Long, the infant son of a palace concubine, to ascend the throne, not because he was destined for greatness, but because he couldn't object. A child emperor was the safest emperor. For Empress Deng, who had already acted as regent during Emperor He's later years, the coronation of Liu Long meant one thing: continuation. With a baby on the throne, she could continue to govern unchallenged. Ministers loyal to her remained in place. Her influence over policy went undisputed. It was, from a certain perspective, a masterstroke of political self-preservation. But for Liu Long, it meant being trapped in a golden cage. Too young to speak, too young to understand the role he had inherited, and far too young to survive the weight of the expectations placed upon him. The records describe his reign as peaceful. Of course they do. What could possibly go wrong when a 1-year-old is in charge? But the peace was illusory, a calm created by the tight control of Empress Deng and her faction. No edicts were authored by Liu Long. No audiences were held. The baby emperor appeared in ceremonies where he was carried rather than walked, bowed to as a formality, treated with reverence and condescension in equal measure. He was quite literally a living symbol, a breathing placeholder for a dynasty trying to preserve face. He reigned for just 8 months. In 106 CE, the child fell ill, or so the chronicles tell us. Ancient texts offer no medical detail, just a single phrase: he died young. Perhaps it was disease, a common fate for infants in pre-modern courts. Perhaps it was exhaustion, stress, or a slow decline hastened by the endless weight of ceremonial obligations imposed on a body barely past infancy. Or perhaps, less romantically, it was politics, a quiet removal now masked by history's polite vagueness. After his death, Liu Long was posthumously named Emperor Shang, meaning young or lesser. Not exactly a flattering legacy, but an honest one. He was buried with honors befitting an emperor, his tomb small but dignified. The court mourned publicly, and within weeks, Empress Deng elevated Liu Hu, the boy's older half-brother, to the throne as Emperor An. The system had survived another transition, barely. What remains unsettling about Liu Long's reign is how easily the machinery of empire adapted around a literal infant. There was no pause, no rebellion, no serious debate about fitness. The rituals went on, as if the throne could be occupied by anyone, even someone unable to speak. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting lesson from this miniature reign, that power, once hollowed out, can still wear the robes of legitimacy long after it has lost all meaning. But Liu Long's brief, quiet tragedy would not be the last of its kind. The Han dynasty, like many before and after, continued its pattern of child emperors, fragile transitions, and political puppetry. And just a generation later, another young ruler, this time at the start of the Liu Song dynasty, would meet a similar fate. He would be older than Liu Long, old enough to understand fear, old enough to realize, too late, that the throne beneath him was not a seat of power, but a trapdoor. His name was Emperor Shao of Song, and he would die not as a baby, but as a teenager who saw the knife coming. 16. Emperor Shao of Liu Song. If history is the story of decisions and their consequences, then Emperor Shao of Song lived in a chapter where decisions were made for him, and the consequences came anyway. Crowned in 422 CE at the age of 17, Emperor Shao, born Liu Yifu, was the eldest son of Emperor Wu of Liu Song, the founder of the dynasty. The throne was, by all rights, his. His bloodline was legitimate, his succession uncontested, and yet, within 2 years of ascending the dragon throne, he was dead. Not from war, not from illness, but from that most familiar of diseases in imperial courts, disappointment. Liu Yifu was not unintelligent, nor was he cruel, but he was unprepared, uninterested, and deeply out of step with the expectations placed upon him. Unlike his father, who had risen through military ranks and understood the cost of governance, Shao preferred leisure. He enjoyed music, feasting, and the company of entertainers. In the capital, this was called immaturity. In the countryside, it was whispered about as decadence. At court, it was viewed, by ministers and generals alike, as treason by neglect. And perhaps it was, but then again, he was 17. The age when most sons of nobles were just beginning their public careers. Liu Yifu was tasked with maintaining an entire empire. The bureaucracy expected him to lead, the generals expected him to strategize, the ministers expected him to listen. He did none of these things. Whether out of arrogance, youth, or plain exhaustion, he remained disengaged, and the men around him, many of whom had served under his father in the battlefield, began to suspect the dynasty would not survive under such hands. Chief among them was Shu Xianji, a powerful minister who had been loyal to Emperor Wu and saw himself as the guardian of state order. Along with 2 other senior officials, he decided that the problem was not the throne, it was the boy sitting on it. In 424, they acted. Liu Yifu was summoned under the pretext of a court ritual, quietly placed under house arrest, and stripped of his titles. He did not fight. Perhaps he didn't believe they would go through with it, or perhaps he understood the rules of the palace better than most, that power is only power if others agree to pretend it is. Weeks later, he was killed in secret, his death marked by a quiet announcement and a modest mourning period. Officially, it was said that he had passed in peace, the kind of peace that tends to come after a dagger, not before. His brother, Liu Yilong, was elevated to the throne as Emperor Wen, a ruler known for stability and reform. The regime would later portray the transition as necessary, a correction made in the name of order. But beneath that clean narrative is a murkier truth, that a 17-year-old boy, handed the most powerful seat in the land, was cut down not for what he did, but for what he failed to be. And so, like Liu Long before him, Emperor Shao became another young casualty of dynastic theatre, a boy emperor undone not by enemies, but by the people who should have protected him. His reign is a cautionary whisper, not about the corrupting influence of power, but about the suffocating weight of it. But he was not the last Liu to fall short of the throne's expectations. Just a few decades later, another teenage emperor would try his hand at survival. His name was Ruzi Ying, the final emperor of the Western Han. He, too, would wear the crown too young, and like so many before him, he would find that crowns given in chaos are rarely meant to last. 17. Ruzi Ying. By the time Ruzi Ying became emperor in 6 CE, the Western Han dynasty was already running on myth. It still had the symbols, the dragon robes, the jade seals, the ancestral temples, but its institutions were rotting from within. Corruption flourished. The court had become a maze of flattery and factionalism, and behind every emperor was a shadow larger than the throne itself, Wang Mang. Ru Ziying was born into this dysfunction. His exact birth date is debated, but he was around 5 years old when he was named heir by Wang Mang, the powerful regent who controlled the court under the nominal rule of the young Emperor Ping. When Ping died suddenly and suspiciously in 6 CE, Wang Mang chose Ru Ziying as his successor, not because of his talents, not because of his bloodline, but because Ru Ziying, a toddler, was the perfect emperor in Wang Mang's puppet theater. He reigned, if one can call it that, for just a few years. In that time he had no say in policy, no power over the court, no agency whatsoever. He was a figurehead, raised on a throne of convenience, wielded as a human shield by a regent who had no intention of stepping aside. In 9 CE, Wang Mang finally dropped the act. He forced Ru Ziying to abdicate and declared the end of the Han dynasty, establishing his own regime, the short-lived Jin dynasty. The boy emperor, just 8 years old, was deposed and demoted. He lived for several more years in exile before being quietly executed in 25 CE, when loyalists of the restored Han regime feared he might become a rallying point for rebellion. His life ended not with scandal, but with silence, the kind of silence that surrounds loose ends. 18. Emperor Shang of Tang, Li Chongmao. Every dynasty has its moment of reckoning, a crack in the facade where the illusion of divine mandate slips and what's left is just a family fighting over a chair. For the Tang dynasty, one of China's most culturally luminous empires, that crack split wide open in the year 710. The death of Emperor Zhongzong, likely poisoned in the imperial palace, set off a power struggle so brazen, so tangled, that it's a wonder it didn't tear the whole dynasty apart right there and then. Caught in the middle of that storm was a 12-year-old boy named Li Chongmao, who would briefly wear the title of Emperor Shang of Tang. His reign lasted only 17 days, just long enough for the adults around him to finish their knife fight. Born the 9th son of Emperor Zhongzong, Li Chongmao had no illusions of grandeur. He was a quiet figure in the court, a minor prince with a royal name but no real role. His rise to the throne wasn't ambition, it was insurance. When Zhongzong died, poisoned most likely by his own wife, Empress Wei, the court was thrown into disarray. Empress Wei declared her young son the new emperor and installed herself as regent. It was a familiar formula, a child on the throne, the real power behind the curtain. Wei had long admired Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, and likely saw herself following in those imperial footsteps. The only problem was that Wu Zetian had been a genius of statecraft. Empress Wei was not. Her regency lasted days. Within 2 weeks, another faction struck, led by Li Longji, the future Emperor Xuanzong, and Princess Taiping, a political force in her own right. The palace was taken by force. Empress Wei was killed, her supporters were purged, and Li Chongmao, barely old enough to recite court protocols, was quietly deposed. He hadn't made a single decision during his reign. He hadn't issued a decree, met with a minister, or signed a law. He had been emperor in name only, a royal bookmark, while the real story turned its page. And then he vanished. After his deposition, he was given the title Prince of Hui, a kind of noble consolation prize that sounded dignified but meant little. He lived out the rest of his short life far from court, largely forgotten. Some records say he died at 19, others suggest closer to 15. Either way, the Tang court moved on, and he never held power again. His tomb was modest, his name nearly lost in the layers of dynastic ambition that had used him as a pawn. But his brief story leaves a bitter taste. because it reminds us how often power dresses up its violence in ceremony, how a boy can be placed on a throne not to rule, but to serve as a shield. Li Chongmao was never meant to lead. He was meant to buy time, a disposable emperor in a war between regents and revolutionaries. And he was not alone, because barely a generation later, another child would be handed the reins of an empire collapsing under its own contradictions. He would sit the throne not in grandeur, but in mourning, the last emperor of his line. His name was Emperor Jing of Northern Zhou, and his reign would end not in failure, but in erasure. 19. Emperor Jing of Northern Zhou. By the 6th century CE, China had become a patchwork of shifting dynasties and warlord regimes, each claiming legitimacy, none strong enough to hold the title unchallenged. Amid the chaos, the Northern Zhou dynasty briefly rose to prominence, a state founded by the Xianbai, a nomadic people who had adopted Han customs, language and bureaucracy. Their rulers wore Chinese robes, minted Chinese coins, and prayed to Chinese ancestors. But their throne was built on a battlefield, and by the time Emperor Jing took that throne, it was already shaking. His name was Yuwen Chan, and he was around 6 or 7 when he became emperor in 579 CE. He was the son of Emperor Xuan of Northern Zhou, a man so erratic and volatile that the court probably breathed a collective sigh of relief when he died. Xuan had abdicated the throne shortly before his death, passing it to his son not out of trust, but out of convenience. The plan was simple: install a child as emperor, rule through regents, and clean up the mess left behind. What followed was anything but clean. The regent who stepped forward was Yang Jian, a shrewd and calculating general who had married into the royal family. He presented himself as a loyal protector of the boy emperor, a defender of the realm, but behind the scenes he was consolidating power with surgical precision. Ministers loyal to the Yuwen family were dismissed or executed. Military command was centralized. Imperial authority was quietly siphoned away from the palace and into Yang Jian's hands. Yuwen Chan, still a child, had no say in any of it. In 581, after just 2 years on the throne, the inevitable happened. Yang Jian forced Yuwen Chan to abdicate. The Northern Zhou dynasty was dissolved, and the Sui dynasty was born. On paper, it was a peaceful transition. No rebellions, no civil war, just a quiet reshuffling of titles. In practice, it was a palace coup, the kind history prefers to describe in passive voice. Yuwen Chan was given the title Duke of Jie, a name that stripped him of all imperial dignity. He was moved out of the capital, and then, in 585, at the age of around 12, he was dead. Some accounts suggest illness, others hint at assassination, ordered by Yang Jian to eliminate any future claimants to the throne. The truth is probably somewhere in between. A child too royal to ignore, too powerless to protect. Emperor Jing was the last of his dynasty. A child placed on the throne as a formality, used by adults who needed a transition and discarded once his purpose was served. His reign was short, his death quiet, his legacy erased beneath the weight of the empire that replaced him. But if Northern Zhou ended in silence, our next emperor's reign would end in screaming, not from battlefields or courtiers, but from within a royal family torn apart by betrayal. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, where Confucianism ruled with the sharpness of a blade, a young king named Danzhong would learn that uncles are not always protectors, and crowns can be ripped away by blood just as easily as by war. 20. King Danzhong of Joseon. In a kingdom founded on hierarchy, scholarship, and strict social codes, the most dangerous place for a child to stand is at the top. Danzhong of Joseon, born Yi Honghui, ascended the Korean throne in 1452 at the age of 12. His father, King Munjong, had died after just 2 years as king. His death left the country in the hands of a boy barely old enough to recite the Confucian Analects. But in Joseon, Korea, where government was run by ministers and bureaucrats, not military men, a child king could be managed. At least that was the theory. Danjong's early reign was shaped by a regency led by Hwang Bo-in and Kim Jong-seo, high-ranking court officials who tried to maintain stability. They managed court rituals, appointments, and diplomacy, all in the name of the boy king. But hovering above them all was a figure who would change the course of the dynasty. Grand Prince Suyang, Danjong's uncle. Suyang believed the kingdom would not survive in the hands of bureaucrats shielding a weak underage monarch. And he may have been right, but what he did with that belief would haunt the court for generations. In 1453, Suyang staged a coup. He seized control of the palace, executed Kim Jong-seo and his faction, and declared himself protector of the throne. Danjong, still only 14, was forced to stand in silence as his court was decapitated. A year later, he was formally forced to abdicate. Suyang declared himself King Sejong, a brilliant, ruthless ruler who strengthened the state but left a moral stain that never fully washed away. As for Danjong, he was exiled to a remote province, stripped of his title, forbidden to write, to speak freely, or even to mourn. But the court still whispered his name. Loyalists plotted his restoration. And in 1457, at the age of 17, Danjong was executed, under orders from his uncle, after an alleged plot to restore him was discovered. The boy who had been crowned king with fanfare died alone, anonymously, with his name stricken from royal records for centuries. But history has a long memory. In the late 17th century, long after Sejong was dead and Danjong a ghost, his name was restored. His tomb was honored. He became a symbol of innocence betrayed, of virtue lost, of a monarchy that claimed divine order but often operated on fratricide. And he is not alone, because before Danjong's body had even cooled, another child king would take the throne of a neighboring kingdom, Goryeo, and meet a fate so similar it's hard not to wonder if history was simply repeating itself, indifferent to the age of its victims. His name was King Chang, and he would be 9 years old when the crown was placed on his head, and less than 10 when it was torn off. 21. King Chang of Goryeo. In the final century of the Goryeo dynasty, power had become a game of shadows, where real authority moved in the margins while young kings were installed, dethroned, or eliminated like ceremonial chess pieces. King Chang of Goryeo was one such piece. A child born into the storm of late 14th century Korea, he would be raised to kingship at the age of 9, caught between two titanic forces that cared more for control than for continuity. His reign lasted less than a year. His legacy lasted even less. He was born in 1380 as Wang Chang, the only son of King Yu of Goryeo. His father, though technically a monarch, had long since been overshadowed by his military commander, the formidable General Yi Seong-gi, a man whose battlefield victories had kept Goryeo alive against Mongol invasions and northern threats, but whose ambitions were beginning to outgrow the dynasty he served. By 1388, the tension between King Yu and General Yi had reached a breaking point. Yu had ordered Yi to march north against the rising Ming dynasty, which had recently overthrown the Yuan in China. But Yi, sensing the mission was doomed, and perhaps realizing the real enemy was behind him, turned his army around and marched on the capital instead. This wasn't just defiance, it was a coup. King Yu was deposed, and with the throne suddenly vacant, the question became who would sit on it. Yi could not take it for himself, not yet. The Confucian norms of the time still required a fig leaf of legitimacy, and the public had to be softened before the old dynasty could be replaced. The solution was simple and cruel. Take King Yu's 9-year-old son, Chang, and place him on the throne. The boy was young enough to control, royal enough to satisfy protocol, and quiet enough to not interfere. So in the summer of 1388, Chang was crowned king of Goryeo. His coronation was full of ceremony and speeches, but behind the palace curtains, the real decisions were being made by Yi Seong-gye and his allies. Chang's reign was a political interlude, an imperial comma inserted between regimes. And, unsurprisingly, it didn't last. The presence of both the deposed King Yu and his son posed a risk to Yi's plans. Loyalists could rally around them. Yu could attempt a comeback. Chang, with age, might even develop a will of his own. These risks were unacceptable. In less than a year, both father and son were gone. Yu was executed in secret, formally recorded as a death in exile. Chang, just 10 years old, was dethroned and sent into house arrest. It was a quiet end, almost eerily so. A brief announcement in court. A new king, King Gongyang, installed in his place. Chang disappeared from public view. Official records state he died not long after, though the cause is left vague, as it always is when history chooses silence over scandal. What makes Chang's story especially bitter is the utter absence of agency. He never chose to be king. He never ruled. His only act, if it can be called that, was to exist at a time when powerful men needed a boy to wear the crown while they rearranged the architecture of the state. And when that phase was over, he was removed like a stage prop, stored in the wings and eventually discarded. In many ways, Chang represents the final gasp of the Goryeo monarchy, a child ushered onto the throne just as the floor beneath it was being dismantled. Within a few years, Yi Seong-gye would dissolve the Goryeo dynasty entirely and found a new one, the Joseon dynasty, which would rule Korea for the next 5 centuries, but not without echoes. Because just as Goryeo collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, so too would a neighboring kingdom, Ayutthaya in what is now Thailand, find itself placing a crown on a boy too young to understand the forces circling him. A boy named Yotfa, who would wear the title of king for a heartbeat before being devoured by his own court. 22. King Yotfa of Ayutthaya. The story of King Yotfa reads less like history and more like a fable carved into temple walls, a cautionary tale of youth, power, and the devouring nature of ambition. Crowned king of Ayutthaya at the age of about 11 or 12, Yotfa was the son of Boromaracha II, one of the most capable kings of the Ayutthaya kingdom, which by the mid-15th century had become a dominant power in Southeast Asia. Yotfa's ascension should have marked a new chapter. Instead, it became his obituary. The Ayutthaya court was not short on ceremony, nor was it short on danger. Beneath the gold and incense was a structure built on military power, hereditary alliances, and an elite class of mandarins and princes who viewed the throne less as sacred and more as strategic. For a strong monarch, this arrangement could be managed. For a child, it was a death trap. When Boromaracha II died in 1448, his son Yotfa was declared king. The coronation, as expected, was lavish. Royal dances, temple rituals, elephant parades, the kind of public display designed to make people forget how fragile the dynasty actually was. Behind closed doors, however, the power vacuum was already opening. In theory, Yotfa's mother, Queen Si-Suda-chan, acted as regent, but her position was controversial, her alliances unstable. Rumors swirled of palace factions, of uncles and cousins quietly assembling militias. The court had not been prepared for a child king. And worse, it had not been prepared for a regent who refused to be invisible. Si-Suda-chan began consolidating power. She replaced key officials, promoted allies, even restructured some court protocols. Her ambition made enemies quickly. Her rule was viewed by some as illegitimate, a woman overreaching in a man's domain. By others, it was simply an excuse, a reason to speed up what everyone knew was coming, a coup. By 1453, the coup arrived. Accounts differ in the details. Some say it was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, others a sudden uprising, but the result was the same. Queen Si Suda-chan was overthrown. King Yotfa, still barely into adolescence, was executed, likely on the orders of one of his relatives. The throne passed to King Tralokanat, a more stable, more seasoned candidate who would go on to reign for decades. Yotfa, meanwhile, was reduced to a name on a line in a royal chronicle. His body, unlike his father's, was not laid in a monument. His death was not honored with rites. It was treated as a necessary correction. And yet, what lingers is not the correction. It's the pattern. Another boy king handed a crown he could not lift. Another child placed between palace factions as a placeholder, then removed when the adults grew impatient. And though Ayutthaya moved on, the story of Yotfa would echo across the region, because just beyond the mountains, in the Nguyen dynasty of Vietnam, another boy emperor was preparing to ascend, 15 years old, surrounded by whispers, trapped in a court that was both his protector and his executioner. His name was Kien Phuc, and he would be the 9th emperor in less than 40 years. 23. Emperor Kien Phuc. There is something particularly bleak about being born into a dynasty addicted to self-destruction. Emperor Kien Phuc, crowned in 1883 at the age of just 15, entered the imperial court of the Nguyen dynasty not as a ruler in waiting, but as the latest heir in a lineage being chewed apart by factionalism, foreign intrusion, and outright paranoia. Vietnam at the time was facing external pressure from France and internal corrosion from its own mandarins. The Nguyen court in Hue, once a fortress of ritual and hierarchy, had become a political blood sport. By the time Kien Phuc was installed as emperor, the dynasty had already seen 8 monarchs rise and fall in less than 4 decades. Many of them through suspicious deaths, forced abdications, or assassinations veiled as illnesses. Kien Phuc was plucked from a side branch of the royal family, groomed quickly, and elevated after the abrupt and shadowy death of Emperor Hiep Hua, another monarch who had run afoul of palace politics. Kien Phuc's elevation was orchestrated by the regents Ton Tat Tuyet and Nguyen Van Tung, who wielded more real power than any boy emperor could hope to muster. Almost immediately, tensions surrounded the young ruler. He was intelligent, reportedly inquisitive, and uncomfortably aware of his symbolic role. Unlike many child emperors before him, Kien Phuc was not easily manipulated. He began asking questions. He scrutinized decisions. He whispered concerns, and those whispers became dangerous. The court was already in crisis. French colonists were pressing harder. Internal reformers were pushing back. The regents, eager to maintain their authority, saw the emperor's curiosity as a liability. Less than a year after his coronation, in July 1884, Kien Phuc died suddenly. Official records attribute the death to illness. Unofficial accounts, whispered in the corridors of Hue and passed down in footnotes, speak of poison. He was 15. He ruled for 8 months, and in that time the dynasty neither strengthened nor stabilized. It merely held its breath and waited for the next boy to try. Because the wheel kept turning, and Kien Phuc, like those before him, became just another fragile spoke broken in silence. 24. Emperor Kang Ting, Nguyen Quang Tuan. At first glance, Nguyen Quang Tuan, also known by his imperial title Emperor Kang Ting, seems to stand apart from the long list of tragic boy rulers. He wasn't crowned as a pawn by scheming regents. He didn't sit helplessly under the thumb of an empress dowager. He was the heir to a revolution, the son of a man who had torn Vietnam's feudal map in half and redrawn it by force. But when the tide turned and the world crashed down around him, Quang Tuan became something more familiar, a teenage monarch crushed under the collapsing weight of empire. He was born in 1783 during the height of the Tay Son Rebellion, a populist uprising that had, over 2 decades, destroyed the existing feudal order. His father, Nguyen Hue, better known as Emperor Quang Trung, was a military genius, the kind of figure who wins impossible battles, unites warring provinces, and walks into the capital cities of rival dynasties without resistance. Quang Trung had routed both Chinese and Vietnamese enemies with dazzling speed and founded a new regime on the ashes of the old. And then, in 1792, he died suddenly. He was just 40. The Tay Son dynasty, built almost entirely on his charisma and strategic brilliance, was left to a 9-year-old boy. Nguyen Quang Tuan was declared emperor under the reign title Can Thinh. The coronation was grand but hollow. He was a child in a palace full of adults who owed everything to his father and nothing to him. The court was split between loyalists, opportunists, and exhausted war generals. The dynasty had barely been secured. The southern Nguyen lords, once defeated, were gathering strength again, especially under a ruthless young general named Nguyen An, a future emperor who would prove to be everything Quang Tuan wasn't: shrewd, methodical, patient. The regency around Can Thinh did what most regencies do in times of panic. It squabbled, it silenced dissent, it tried to preserve an order that was already dissolving. The boy emperor, meanwhile, was pushed forward as a symbol, his father's name etched behind him like a shield, even as cracks began forming in the walls. To his credit, Quang Tuan wasn't idle. As he grew into his teens, he tried to assume control. He issued reforms, he reorganized the army. He attempted, with only partial success, to assert himself over his generals. He was said to be intelligent and well-read, raised on both Confucian classics and military history. But intelligence does not win wars. Experience does. And by the time he tried to lead, his enemies were already closing in. By 1801, Nguyen An had seized the southern capital. The Tay Son court panicked, moving north, evacuating Hanoi, scrambling to hold what little ground they had left. At barely 18, Can Thinh attempted one last military campaign to push back the Nguyen army. It failed. His generals defected. His ranks collapsed. The revolution that had once promised justice and unity was now broken, fragmented into regional resistance and petty vengeance. In 1802, Nguyen An marched into Thang Long, modern Hanoi, and proclaimed himself Emperor Jia Long, founder of the Nguyen dynasty. The Tay Son regime was officially over. Quang Tuan, the boy emperor, fled in disguise. He was captured weeks later, betrayed by a local magistrate, and brought in chains before the new court. He was 19. Jia Long ordered his execution, not just of Quang Tuan, but of nearly every remaining member of the Tay Son royal family. Bodies were exhumed, tombs desecrated, family members exterminated. The goal was not just punishment, it was obliteration, a total historical erasure. And yet the story survives. Can Thinh is remembered not as a great ruler, but as a boy who inherited a dream too large for his lifetime, a child of revolution, born in a palace built by guerrillas, tasked with holding an empire together through raw willpower. He failed, but the failure was never his alone. It belonged to a dynasty built too fast, with too many enemies and too few friends once its founder was gone. His name, buried by official historians for generations, now sits quietly in schoolbooks beneath layers of caution and contradiction. A teenage emperor, a fallen house, a brief flicker of what could have been. And as Vietnam rebuilt itself under a new dynasty, another boy far across the former Crusader states would briefly rise to power, not by birthright, but by inheritance of a kingdom forever on the brink. His name was Baldwin V of Jerusalem, and his crown would come with a terminal diagnosis. 25. Baldwin V of Jerusalem. The Kingdom of Jerusalem by the late 12th century was less a kingdom and more a concept held together by sand, scripture, and desperation. The Crusader state, founded in the wake of the First Crusade, had spent decades trying to maintain its foothold in the Holy Land while surrounded by forces that wanted it gone. Into this furnace of faith and faction stepped Baldwin V, crowned king in 1185 at the age of just 8. He would be dead within a year. His story begins, as many royal tragedies do, with succession. His uncle, Baldwin IV, had ruled Jerusalem for a decade, despite being ravaged by leprosy. A brilliant tactician known as the Leper King, Baldwin IV had managed to hold back Saladin's forces for years, but his illness made heirs a problem. He had no children, and his sister Sibylla's choice of husband, the unpopular Guy of Lusignan, had thrown the nobility into chaos. So Baldwin IV, in a final attempt to stabilize the kingdom, named his young nephew Baldwin V as co-king. It was a compromise. The boy would inherit the throne, bypassing his mother and her divisive husband, and the regency would be shared by trusted nobles, including Count Raymond of Tripoli. It was, in theory, a political solution. In practice, it was a slow-motion disaster. Baldwin V was 8 years old when crowned. His reign, if one can call it that, lasted just over a year. He was a child of frail health, described as delicate and quiet, never seen without attendants and cloistered tutors. Though technically king, he never ruled. The kingdom was run by council, nobles jockeying for influence, crusader factions split between loyalty and ambition, while Saladin quietly rebuilt his army across the border. In 1186, Baldwin V fell ill. He died suddenly in Acre. The cause of death remains a mystery. Some say it was natural, others suspect poison, orchestrated by factions eager to restore Sibylla and her husband Guy to the throne. Whatever the truth, the power vacuum exploded. Sibylla claimed the crown. Guy followed, and within a year, Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin. Baldwin V's death marked the end of any serious attempt to keep the Crusader kingdom unified. He had been installed as a placeholder, a hope that the rival factions could hold off long enough to regroup. But history doesn't wait. And Jerusalem, the city so many had died to control, was lost just months after the boy king's funeral. Today, Baldwin V is a footnote, a royal child placed on a dying throne, in a dying kingdom, in a dying age. He left no laws, no speeches, no legacy, only a crown too heavy for a child's head and a kingdom that crumbled around it. And yet his story would repeat, because in the Eastern Mediterranean, the island kingdom of Cyprus would soon crown its own child king. Another boy with no real power, handed a throne for the sake of appearances. His name was Hugh II, and he would die even younger. 26. Hugh II of Cyprus. The island of Cyprus, glittering in the Eastern Mediterranean, was supposed to be a crusader success story, a refuge carved out of chaos. After Richard the Lionheart captured it from the Byzantines in 1191, the island was transformed into a kingdom of knights and courts, a place where chivalric ideals could be polished to a high sheen, even as the mainland Holy Lands began to splinter. But behind the polished facade, Cyprus functioned like any other medieval monarchy, insecure, dynastic, and always one succession crisis away from collapse. Enter Hugh II of Cyprus, who inherited the crown in 1253, not through conquest or achievement, but through blood and death. He was just a baby, and by the time he died 13 years later, he had never truly ruled. Born in 1252, Hugh was the only son of Henry I of Cyprus, a king who had spent his own reign walking a political tightrope between local barons, papal influence, and the tangled loyalties of the fading Crusader states. When Henry died in 1253, he left behind a throne and a 1-year-old boy. That throne, as it turned out, would be the safest seat in the kingdom, because the real business of governing would be conducted elsewhere. The regency was handed to Queen Plaisance of Antioch, Hugh's mother, and a politically savvy figure who had no intention of ruling quietly. She installed herself as de facto sovereign, overseeing court appointments, diplomatic relations, and even legal reforms, all in her son's name, of course. Hugh became a figurehead before he could speak. His royal status was a useful shield, giving Plaisance and her allies the legitimacy they needed to keep baronial rivals in check. It worked for a while. Cyprus remained stable during the early years of Hugh's minority, especially compared to the neighboring kingdom of Jerusalem, which by then was more theory than fact. But the court was not without tensions. Rival claimants to the regency emerged. Plaisance died in 1261, just as Hugh was entering adolescence. A new regent, Hugh of Antioch, stepped in, this time from a different branch of the royal family. The transition was not smooth, and Hugh VII, still officially king, still not calling any of the shots. He was described in records as frail and introverted, more a creature of the court than a future monarch of action. No letters remain, no proclamations. His image appears on coins, but always under the stylized anonymity of monarchic symbolism, not as a person, but as a silhouette of authority. By 1267, the politics of Cyprus were shifting again. The regent Hugh of Antioch was preparing to strengthen his own claim by marrying into further influence. And then the real monarch, the teenage Hugh II, died. Suddenly, quietly, without fanfare. He was 13 or 14, the cause of death never clearly recorded. Some say illness, others imply political convenience. But in all accounts, the reaction was the same. Muted. The kingdom had been run for so long without him, his passing barely disturbed the machinery. With his death, the Lusinian line of Cyprus moved sideways. The regent, Hugh of Antioch, simply became Hugh III, the next king. The shift was almost seamless, a transition from one Hugh to another, with no disruption to court rituals or foreign policy. But in that seamlessness lies something quietly disturbing. Hugh II's life was ceremonial, his reign procedural. He held the title of king from infancy to early adolescence, but at no point did he make decisions. He was the ultimate placeholder, a crown without a voice, a throne without a will. And yet, his death marks the end of a chapter in Cypriot history, one where the illusion of continuity was sustained entirely through the body of a child. It wouldn't be the last time a boy would be sacrificed on the altar of royal continuity, because in Sicily and Jerusalem, another heir, even younger than Hugh, was already being positioned as the last hope of a fading dynasty. A boy named Conradin, whose very name carried too much meaning, too much blood, and too much danger. 27. Conradin. Some royal children are born with burdens so heavy they collapse under them before they even know what power is. Conradin, the last legitimate male heir of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, was one such child. Born in 1252, just 2 years after the death of his grandfather Frederick II, he inherited titles that spanned continents and grudges that stretched even farther. King of Jerusalem, King of Sicily, Duke of Swabia. None of these came with actual control. What they came with instead was expectation and enemies. The Hohenstaufen dynasty had ruled the Holy Roman Empire and southern Italy with an iron fist and a flair for confrontation. But by the mid-13th century, it was collapsing. The papacy, long antagonistic toward the Hohenstaufens, had declared a holy war against the family line. Frederick II's son, Conrad IV, Conradin's father, died when the boy was just 2 years old. The papacy declared his claim illegitimate. A French prince, Charles of Anjou, was installed in Sicily with papal blessing. The message was clear: the Hohenstaufen legacy was over. But no one told Conradin. Raised in Bavaria by loyal family members, he was a child of legend before he was a child of state. Stories circulated of his beauty, his intelligence, his promise. Poets called him the Lion of the North. His supporters believed he would reclaim Sicily, reassert Hohenstaufen control over Italy, and avenge his family name, all before his 18th birthday. In 1267, at the age of 15, Conradin led an army into Italy. It was not large, but it was symbolic. Young nobles rallied to him. Ghibelline cities opened their gates. The papacy panicked. Charles of Anjou prepared for war. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268. For a moment, it seemed Conradin had won. His forces overwhelmed Charles's knights, but Charles, a seasoned commander, held back a reserve unit. As Conradin's men began to celebrate, the reserve struck. The Hohenstaufen army was annihilated. Conradin fled but was captured weeks later near the coast. He was taken to Naples. The court convened a trial, or what passed for one. Despite being a royal, despite his youth, despite the tradition of clemency for noble prisoners, he was sentenced to death. He was 16. On October 29th, 1268, he was led to a scaffold in the marketplace. Accounts describe a calm, composed boy who handed his gloves to a companion and forgave his enemies. His head was struck from his body in front of a crowd that, by many reports, wept openly. The papacy had made its point. The dynasty was over. But martyrdom has a way of resurrecting what politics tries to bury. Within decades, Conradin became a legend. His name appeared in ballads and chronicles. Pilgrims visited his supposed burial site. Even Dante, writing in exile, would mention him as a symbol of unjust fate. He was the last legal king of Jerusalem, the last male Hohenstaufen, and arguably the last medieval monarch whose death felt like a moment where Europe could have turned another way, and didn't. And he wasn't the last teenage king to die at the hands of men who claimed to be acting in God's name, because to the north, in the chilly courts of Bohemia and Hungary, another crown would fall to a teenager whose death would be just as sudden, just as political, and just as unresolved. Wenceslaus III, they called him, the last of the Przemyslid line, and he would not even make it to his coronation. 28. Wenceslaus III. By the time Wenceslaus III walked to the dark hallways of the Olomouc Castle in the summer of 1306, the weight of 3 crowns already sat on his head. King of Bohemia, King of Hungary, titular King of Poland. He was 16, a teenager with more titles than years, and none of them came with peace. Each crown was an inheritance wrapped in iron, the kind passed down not through stability, but through crisis, betrayal, and quiet desperation. Wenceslaus was born into the last generation of the Przemyslid dynasty, a line of kings who had ruled Bohemia for centuries with a mixture of brute power and careful diplomacy. His father, Wenceslaus II, had expanded the family's influence far beyond the Bohemian forests, acquiring the Hungarian crown for his son by marrying him into a claim. The family was ambitious, ruthless even, but ambition in medieval Central Europe was a blood sport, and by 1305 the Przemyslid game was coming apart. When his father died suddenly, Wenceslaus III became King of Bohemia. He was already King of Hungary by name, having been crowned in 1301 at the age of 10, when the Hungarian throne was vacant and factions scrambled to find a suitable foreign puppet. But Hungary had never truly accepted him. The Hungarian nobles, famously independent and deeply suspicious of outsiders, viewed the Bohemian boy king with polite hostility. He spent most of his brief Hungarian reign in absentia, controlled by advisors and tolerated more than obeyed. By 1305, he had effectively abandoned Hungary altogether. Poland, meanwhile, was a different kind of disaster. Wenceslaus II had seized the Polish crown shortly before his death, uniting the fragmented lands under Bohemian rule. Young Wenceslaus inherited that claim too, and with it a fresh set of enemies. Polish nobles, deeply divided themselves, were growing restless under foreign rule. The teenage king had no real Polish base of power, only a title, and that title, like the others, was increasingly more burden than blessing. In the summer of 1306, Wenceslaus III began a campaign to consolidate his position in Poland. He set off from Bohemia toward Krakow, accompanied by a small entourage. He never made it. On August the 4th, 1306, while staying in Olomouc, he was murdered. The details remain a mystery. The identity of the killer was never confirmed. Some chroniclers speak of a single assassin, others of a conspiracy. Some blame rival claimants to the Polish throne. Others suggest disgruntled Hungarian agents. A few even whisper of a Bohemian plot from within, a final act of dynastic cannibalism. The facts, like so many royal deaths of the period, were swiftly buried beneath ceremony and suspicion. What is clear is that the murder ended more than a reign. It ended a dynasty. Wenceslaus III was the last male member of the Przemyslid family. With his death, the centuries-long royal house of Bohemia ceased to exist. The throne passed to new hands, eventually to the Luxembourgs. But the transition was chaotic. The death of a 16-year-old boy, alone in a provincial town, reshaped the power map of Central Europe. And unlike many young kings who died as mere figureheads, Wenceslaus III had tried to rule. He had issued edicts. He had planned campaigns. He had maneuvered politically. He was young, yes, perhaps naive, perhaps overextended, but he was not invisible, and perhaps that visibility in the end was what doomed him. His legacy is a ghost, a final spark of a family that burned bright for generations and then vanished in a single knife stroke. But even after dynasties die, history isn't finished, because far to the south, in the fractured lands of Hungary and Austria, another boy would rise. A child born after his father's death, a monarch crowned as an infant. They called him Ladislaus the Posthumous, and his reign would be just as cursed. 29. Ladislaus the Posthumous. History has no shortage of ironic names, but few are as cruelly poetic as Ladislaus the Posthumous. Born in 1440, after the death of his father, King Albert II of Hungary and King of the Romans, Ladislaus entered the world with two things already guaranteed: a crown and a civil war. He was king before he drew his first breath. His father had died months earlier, likely of dysentery, while on a military campaign. With Albert's death, the crowns of Hungary, Bohemia, and the Habsburg lands were all thrown into succession crises. Different factions scrambled to claim the boy's inheritance. But for Ladislaus, infancy was less a time of innocence and more a time of imprisonment. He was placed under the protection, or control, depending on perspective, of Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, who kept him in a sort of diplomatic custody. The goal was clear: to ensure the Habsburg legacy didn't fall into the wrong hands, while also delaying Ladislaus's access to real power for as long as possible. Years passed. Hungary fell into chaos, Bohemia into rebellion. The boy king was shuffled from castle to castle, more a pawn in a Habsburg chess game than a child. He didn't speak publicly. He didn't issue royal decrees. His regents ruled in his name, all while factions plotted, negotiated, and occasionally tried to rescue him from his golden captivity. By the time Ladislaus was released to claim his throne in the 1450s, he was a teenager, intelligent, cautious, and already seasoned by a life of controlled silence. He began to rule in earnest at around age 14 or 15, issuing edicts, reconciling feuding nobles, and attempting to rebuild the royal authority that had fractured during his minority. And then, just as suddenly as his reign had begun, it ended. In 1457, at the age of 17, Ladislaus died in Prague. The official cause, leukemia, but rumors exploded almost immediately. Poison, said some, orchestrated by enemies who feared a Habsburg restoration. Others pointed fingers at George of Podbrady, a powerful Bohemian noble who had been rising in prominence and would later become king himself. No evidence was ever found. No investigation launched. Ladislaus's death was simply accepted. Like so many other royal deaths that arrived too soon and too quietly, his body was buried with all due ceremony, his name recorded in the lineage of kings, but his legacy was largely erased by what came next, because what followed was the fragmentation of the Habsburg influence in Central Europe, a delay in their eventual dominance, but a delay that would reshape alliances and redraw maps for generations. Ladislaus had been the linchpin, and without him, the entire structure collapsed and rebuilt itself in unfamiliar ways. In the end, Ladislaus the Posthumous lived up to his name in more than just timing. His life was shaped by events that occurred before he was born, and his death echoed into a world he would never see, a king without a childhood, a monarch without a reign, a symbol of what happens when power passes not to the strong or the ready, but to the unborn. And just as the Habsburgs were mourning their child king, the North would bury another boy, this time in the frozen courts of Denmark and Norway. His name was Olaf II to the Danes, Olav IV to the Norwegians, and he would die before reaching adulthood, just as Europe stood on the cusp of its next great convulsion. 30. Olaf II of Denmark, Olav IV of Norway. In the waning years of the 14th century, the political landscape of Scandinavia was a tangled patchwork of dynasties, regents, and uneasy alliances. And at the center of that tangled map sat a boy, Olaf, the only surviving son of King Håkon VI of Norway and Queen Margaret I of Denmark, crowned while still a child and burdened with unifying two kingdoms, maybe even three. Olaf was born in 1370, a child of royal compromise. His mother, Margaret, was the daughter of Valdemar IV, the powerful king of Denmark. His father, Håkon, was the Norwegian king and former Swedish heir. Through Olaf's birth, the crowns of Denmark and Norway found a common heir, one whose lineage could, in theory, bridge the rivalries of the Scandinavian thrones. But the theory came with complications. Olaf's father died in 1380, making the 10-year-old boy king of Norway as Olav IV. 2 years earlier, he had already been crowned Olaf II of Denmark, following the death of his maternal grandfather. He was now, in name, king of two nations, a dual monarch ruling over two culturally distinct, geographically scattered, and politically restive kingdoms. But of course, he ruled in name only. The real power lay with Queen Margaret, his mother. Margaret was no mere regent. She was a political tactician with a sharp understanding of dynastic power, and she effectively ran both Denmark and Norway, while Olaf was still learning how to read court etiquette. Under her rule, the kingdoms remained largely stable. Taxes were collected, and noble alliances were forged with care. Olaf, for his part, showed promise. Chroniclers describe him as intelligent, fair-minded, and energetic. He was being groomed for full kingship. Plans were even made to expand his rule into Sweden, potentially uniting all three Scandinavian kingdoms, a precursor to what would later become the Kalmar Union. But in 1387, while visiting Falsterbo in southern Sweden, Olaf suddenly died. He was just 17. The cause was listed as illness. The reaction was shock and suspicion. Rumors spread that he had been poisoned, perhaps by enemies of Margaret, perhaps by internal court factions. No one was ever charged. No clear motive ever emerged. And Margaret, though devastated, moved swiftly to consolidate power. Olaf's death changed Scandinavian history. Margaret seized the moment to declare herself regent, and then, effectively, queen in all but name. She would go on to establish the Kalmar Union herself, uniting Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her sole leadership. Olaf was posthumously honored, but politically replaced. In the end, Olaf became a hinge, a point between dynastic possibility and political reality. A boy king raised to rule three kingdoms, dead before he could truly rule one. His death, like so many others, arrived not as a climax, but as a transition, and it would not be the last of its kind. Because just as Scandinavia was rewriting its dynasties in ink and ambition, Spain would crown a new king, Louis I, who would reign for 7 brief months and leave behind more questions than answers. 31. Louis I of Spain. If the Spanish monarchy were a stage play, Louis I would be the character who enters just before intermission, stumbles through a few hurried lines, and vanishes before the audience has time to remember his face. Crowned in January 1724, dead by the end of August, Louis I's entire reign lasted 229 days. The kind of historical blip that normally disappears into a footnote. But Louis wasn't just a footnote. He was the living, breathing embodiment of a dynastic experiment gone awkwardly, terribly wrong. Born in 1707 to Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, and his first wife Maria Louisa of Savoy, Louis was bred for monarchy. From infancy, he was surrounded by tutors, courtiers, and Catholic ritual, a childhood steeped in royal doctrine and French etiquette, because Philip was himself a grandson of Louis XIV, imported from Versailles to solidify Bourbon claims in Spain after the War of the Spanish Succession. Louis, as the heir, bore the uneasy burden of being both Spanish and unmistakably French. And then came 1724, the year the script went off book. Philip V, prone to bouts of severe depression and religious obsession, suddenly announced his abdication. Historians still debate his motives. Some say it was exhaustion. Others believe he wanted more time for prayer. Or perhaps he was testing a new political model, ruling from behind the curtain while grooming his son to be a more malleable monarch. Whatever the case, Louis, at age 17, was shoved into the spotlight. He was not ready, and neither was Spain. The country was still reeling from the aftershocks of war, caught between Bourbon centralization and the stubborn autonomy of its regional territories. The court was divided between old Habsburg loyalists and French-style reformers. The clergy distrusted any sign of innovation. And Louis was just a teenager. He tried, to his credit. His early actions suggest a desire to govern seriously. He replaced some ministers. He received ambassadors. He even opened up limited talks about reforming local governance. Nothing radical, but enough to stir unease among conservatives. At the same time, his personal life began to draw attention. His marriage to Louise Elisabeth d'Orléans, a French princess, was turbulent. The two were ill-suited. Gossip poured out of the palace. Some said she despised Spain. Others claimed she mocked him publicly. But none of this had time to bloom into scandal or reform. In the summer of 1724, Louis fell ill. Most sources say smallpox. He died within days, reportedly calm, reportedly resigned. 17 years old, not quite a king, not quite a boy, gone before the crown had time to fit properly. And here's where things get stranger. Philip V, who had supposedly retired from public life, promptly returned to the throne. The abdication was reversed. The ministers were reshuffled back into place. It was as if the experiment had never happened. Louis was buried with pomp and sorrow, but his reign was treated like a royal fever dream, short, intense, and vaguely embarrassing. For decades afterward, Spanish historians avoided the subject. His name rarely appeared in official sermons or court propaganda, but the deeper irony lies in what Louis's reign represented: the danger of novelty in a system designed to resist it. His ascension had promised renewal, perhaps even modernity. His death reinforced inertia. Philip ruled for another 2 decades, increasingly erratic, deeply religious, and entirely uninterested in innovation. The crown tightened its grip, the stage lights dimmed, and Spain slipped quietly into the long dusk of absolutism. Louis XIII, then, was not a failed monarch. He was a reflection of a monarchy that feared its own future, a brief window into what might have been had the court allowed a teenager, however unpolished, to try something different. But while Spain was reverting to the comfort of the old France, Louis's ancestral homeland was preparing for another youthful ruler, one who would ascend the throne in an age of intrigue, marry a queen too famous for her own good, and die before he could leave a lasting imprint. His name was Francis II, and his crown, like Louis's, would fit for only a moment. 32. Francis II of France. There are kings who shape their era, and there are kings who are shaped by it. And then there's Francis II of France, a monarch so completely consumed by the forces swirling around him that his life reads less like a chapter of leadership and more like the tragic prelude to someone else's story. He was born into catastrophe, a period when France was teetering on the edge of religious civil war, its court splintered between powerful noble families and a Catholic Church anxious to assert itself. Born in 1544, Francis was the eldest son of Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici, which meant he was always going to be important. But no one expected he'd be handed the full burden of the Valois dynasty at 15. The circumstances of his rise were sudden and violent. In 1559, during a jousting tournament meant to celebrate his sister's marriage to Philip II of Spain, King Henry II was pierced in the eye by a lance splinter. He lingered for days before dying in excruciating pain. Francis, just 15 and physically frail, became king. Almost immediately, the real power transferred to his in-laws, the House of Guise, a militaristic and ultra-Catholic family led by his uncles, Francis and Charles. They moved quickly, seizing control of the council, sidelining Catherine de' Medici and launching aggressive policies to suppress Protestantism. It was a shadow government wearing royal clothing. Francis was reduced to a symbol, a quiet, delicate figure paraded in ceremony, rarely consulted. Then there was Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, his wife and political twin. Their marriage had been arranged when both were children, uniting France and Scotland under a Catholic alliance. Mary was charming, elegant, and, by most accounts, far more politically adept than her husband. Their marriage was short, childless, and burdened with too much symbolic meaning. The union of crowns, the fusion of dynasties, the last hope of Catholic Europe. But none of it lasted. Less than a year into his reign, in December 1560, Francis fell ill. An ear infection developed into something more serious. Meningitis, perhaps, or a brain abscess. The sources are vague, and the diagnosis has never been settled. What is clear is that the king, not yet 16, suffered days of intense illness before dying quietly in Orléans. Mary wept, the court panicked, and Catherine de' Medici, long sidelined, stepped into the power vacuum as regent for her next son, the 10-year-old Charles IX. Francis II was buried with appropriate ceremony, but in truth, his legacy had already been hijacked. His reign was the spark that lit the fires of the French Wars of Religion, a decades-long period of sectarian bloodshed that would devastate the country. The Guises had used him to tighten Catholic control. Protestants had launched conspiracies against him, and after his death, the court descended into paranoid purges, desperate to hold the collapsing monarchy together. For Mary, his widow, the death changed everything. She returned to Scotland, where her own tragic legend would unfold. For Catherine, it was the beginning of her long manipulative regency, and for France, it was the end of royal innocence, a reminder that kingship was no longer divine or secure. It was vulnerable, mortal. Francis II didn't fail as king. He never had the chance. His short reign was consumed by other people's agendas, other people's wars, other people's fears. And while France mourned its boy king, Russia, vast, cold, and equally unstable, was about to crown one of its own. Fyodor II, a Tsar born into paranoia, raised under suspicion, and killed before his rule could begin to thaw the ice of the time of troubles. 33. Fyodor II of Russia. History is rarely kind to short reigns, but in Russia it can be outright cruel. Fyodor II, crowned Tsar of Russia in 1605, ruled for just a few weeks before vanishing into the cold machinery of power. He was the first and only son of Boris Godunov, the once trusted advisor to Ivan the Terrible, who rose to power through ambition, cunning, and, according to some, a touch of murder. Fyodor was 16 when the crown landed on his head. It was not a coronation, it was a trapdoor. To understand Fyodor's fall, you have to understand the chaos that birthed him. Russia in the early 17th century was not a state, it was a slow-motion implosion. Ivan the Terrible's death in 1584 had left a gaping hole in the Rurik dynasty. His sickly son, Fyodor I, had reigned in name but not in action, while Boris Godunov, brother-in-law and shadow regent, had maneuvered his way to the throne through political finesse and, some whispered, the disappearance of Ivan's youngest son, Dmitri. When Boris officially became Tsar in 1598, it was the first time a ruler without royal blood claimed the Russian crown. It was a fragile claim, and Russia, suspicious, vast, and increasingly paranoid, made him pay for it. A devastating famine struck. Nobles grumbled, peasants rebelled, and then, from across the border, came a rumor. Dmitri, the son everyone thought dead, was alive and marching toward Moscow. That man, known to history as the false Dmitri, was either a bold pretender or a miraculous survivor. Either way, he had the support of Polish nobles, Jesuits, discontented boyars, and just enough of the Russian people to make Boris sweat. Then, in April 1605, Boris Godunov died, possibly of a stroke, possibly something more sudden, but undeniably at the worst possible moment. His death left his teenage son, Fyodor II, sitting on a throne that was already on fire. Fyodor had been raised in luxury, but not in illusion. He was well educated, rare among Russian royals at the time, and fluent in languages, mathematics, and military strategy. Some sources even claim he had a natural gift for leadership, a curiosity about governance, and an honest temperament. But none of that mattered. Russia didn't want a thoughtful king, it wanted a legitimate one. And to many, Fyodor was not it. The boyars, the noble elite of Russia, sensed opportunity. They had long resented Boris's centralized rule, and now saw a way to undo his legacy. The false Dmitri's forces were approaching Moscow, gaining momentum with every step. And Fyodor? He was alone, surrounded by courtiers who had pledged loyalty out of fear, not conviction. For a brief moment there was hope. Fyodor tried to assert control. He issued proclamations. He called for unity. He even sought to negotiate with his enemies. But it was too late. The elite had already shifted allegiance. On June the 10th, 1605, Fyodor and his mother were arrested by boyars loyal to the rebel claimant. And then, silence. Official chronicles say Fyodor died. No further details, no trial, no formal deposition. Just a teenage Tsar quietly erased. Some say he was strangled, others suggest poison. There's even a theory that his death was staged and that he lived out his days in a monastery. But history, ever loyal to its victors, never investigated. The false Dmitri entered Moscow days later and was crowned Tsar. The boy he replaced was already gone. Fyodor's reign lasted less than 2 months. His story is now buried under the broader catastrophe known as the Time of Troubles, a period of civil war, famine, foreign invasion, and dynastic collapse that would last until 1613, when the Romanovs finally seized power. In the grand sweep of that chaos, Fyodor is often treated as a speed bump, a transition figure between regimes. But that misses the tragedy. Because Fyodor didn't just lose his life, he lost the chance to prove what kind of ruler he could have been. In another timeline, he might have stabilized Russia, reconciled with the boyars, or at least delayed the country's descent into violence. But in the one we live in, he was simply a teenager with the wrong name at the wrong time, crowned on the cusp of a political avalanche. And perhaps that's the final irony. He was arguably one of the most qualified young rulers in Russian history. More prepared than the sons of Ivan, more grounded than the man who replaced him, more capable than the nobles who betrayed him. But none of that mattered, not in a Russia that was already preparing for its next illusion, its next dynasty, its next disaster. And if Fyodor's death marked the quiet fade of a dynasty, it would be the last whisper in our long journey. Because long before the Russians fumbled with crowns and conspiracies, the world had already watched as kings and queens died too young in lands far older, on thrones far colder, with endings just as incomplete.